Thank you very much. The Committee on Natural Resources will come to order. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on the unanswered questions about U.S. Park Police's June 1st attack on the peaceful protesters at Lafayette Square. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or his designee. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I'm asking for unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository hnrc.docs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that like it is at all fully in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Anyone present in the hearing room today must wear a mask covering their mouth and nose. The Speaker of the House and the Sergeant at Arms, acting upon the recommendation of the attendant physician, require face coverings for all indoor gatherings over 15 minutes in length, such as this committee meeting. Accordingly, to maintain decorum and protect the safety of members and the staff, the chair will not recognize any member in the hearing room to speak who is not wearing a mask. According to House Rule 17 and Committee Rule 3D, the chair retains the right of recognition of any member who wishes to speak or offer a motion. This right includes the responsibility to maintain decorum. It should be noted it is permitted by the Sergeant of Arms through his guidance that exceptions for members briefly removing their mask to facilitate lip reading by viewers who are deaf or hard of hearing. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. With that, I will now recognize myself for the opening statement. Today, we continue examining the June 1st decision by the U.S. Park Police and its partners to violently remove peaceful protesters from the area around Lafayette Square. At our hearing last month, witnesses told us that law enforcement officers assaulted peaceful protesters and journalists without warning using tear gas and batons. We heard that the clergy at St. John's Church were forced off their own property as for President Trump's photo op, with the diocese calling it a sacrilege. Many questions remain unanswered. Who gave the street clearing order and why? Who authorized the police to assault and gas nonviolent protesters? Was a premeditated plan to dominate the battle scene as administration officials described it? Was there a plan? Was the nonviolent crowd given a clear warning and a safe way to leave? We had hoped the administration could help us answer these questions at the June 29th meeting. They refused to testify, so I'm very glad that Mr. Gregory T. Monahan, Acting Chief of the U.S. Park Service, is with us here today. We are also fortunate to welcome Major Adam DeMarco as the D.C. National Guard's liaison to the Park Police on June 1st. He relayed the orders from the Park Police to the D.C. National Guard as they unfolded. Your presence here is very important and shows much courage, and I thank you for your decorated service to the country, which includes your participation here today. As the events have shown, Lafayette Square was a test run for what is illegal and ongoing crackdown by the Trump administration that is being inflicted on cities across this country, and attempts to escalate those confrontations. Rather than deal with and admit what did occur on June 1st, what was wrong, the administration is doubling down on its response to unarmed civilians in cities like Portland. And despite the mayor's demands in Portland that they leave, and what we saw about with civilians being abducted off the streets without probable cause and taking them away in unarmed vans and without insignia or identification on the part of the law enforcement that took them away. And questions about, continue about Chicago, Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the president has threatened to use similar tactics. President Trump openly says he's sending paramilitary forces to these cities because they are run by Democratic mayors. This raises a crucial question. Was this Park Police-led assault on June 1st motivated by partisan hostility directed from above to those demanding justice for George Floyd and so many other Black men, women, and children, and a very diverse group of people exercising their First Amendment rights from the Washington, D.C. region? My friend and our friend John Lewis made one of his last public appearances at the scene of the Park Police attacks on protesters only 6 days before the June 1st incident. He spent his life doing what most of us know is the right thing, fighting for fair and equal treatment of Black Americans and all Americans. And so I believe it's our duty in Congress as Americans and as human beings to ensure that others fighting for basic fairness do not suffer the same brutality that Mr. Lewis had to endure in his quest for fairness and equity for all people. I think we can do better, and we can be better, and that's why we're here today. Now, let me now turn to the designee for the ranking member. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here today really at what can only be considered Act Two of the Democrats' political theater regarding the events at Lafayette Square. Even just the nature of today's title, that somehow the U.S. Park Police attacked peaceful protesters, is ludicrous. The assertion that these were peaceful protests is completely ignoring the facts. We know that there were acts of arson, there was vandalism, there were assaults on police officers in the days leading up to June 1st. This is even acknowledged by the Democrats' second panel witness in his written testimony, which states that the witness learned that federal law enforcement officers from Park Police and U.S. Secret Service had sustained injuries. However, today's hearing title does aptly note that there are some unanswered questions. I was confident these would remain because the one witness who might be able to answer them was not at the previous hearing, and the majority knew that and yet continued with the hearing for show. Chief Monahan, I'm glad to see you here today. We're honored to have you, and we appreciate you testifying before the committee. You might not have all the answers today, but we'll probably be able to provide some of the facts that were missing from the previous hearing on this topic, so we're grateful for that. My hope is that we'll be able to see beyond the biased scope through which the Democrats are viewing these actions and establish a truthful history of what happened on that day. For example, we need more details about the warnings that were provided and the opportunity protesters were given to disperse. In the last hearing, Democrat witnesses claimed that there were no warnings heard, but a CNN reporter, Caitlin Collins, live tweeted, quote, "The Park Police is now warning protesters to leave. They have given 3 warnings over a loudspeaker." That tweet came at 6:32 p.m. on June 1st. So who are we to believe? But we cannot talk about the events of June 1st in a vacuum. They must be viewed in a larger context. What plans were made prior to June 1st about expanding the perimeter? How did the levels of violence and destruction factor into the decision? We should also compare the scenarios of Lafayette Park to other protests that have occurred in the city. Americans frequently exercise their rights to assemble and protest in Washington. We have numerous, and from all ideological perspectives. We have a number of examples from the Women's March, the March for Life, March for Our Lives, just to name a few. The difference between those events and the events at Lafayette Square are the acts of violence and destruction. While the predetermined narrative surrounding the events at Lafayette Park and other events occurring throughout our nation outlines a story of law enforcement squashing rights, the reality of the situation is quite different. In this case and in others, law enforcement agents acted to secure an area and restore peace, taking reactive measures after acts of violence and destruction. The provokers, the true culprits responsible for thwarting peaceful protests, are the vandals and the rioters. Bad actors have hijacked an important national conversation to push their agenda of violence and disorder. If we're looking to lay blame, those are the individuals you should cast as the villains in this plot, those who ignored the law and created an unsafe environment for peaceful protesters and law enforcement alike. These are the individuals who are responsible for limiting the ability of others to express their thoughts and opinions. Although I do not believe this is the closing act of this political drama, perhaps this is the storyline's plot twist where this committee focuses on facts instead of political points. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get to the truths about the realities facing the men and women who serve our communities as law enforcement officers and answer questions about the decisions that were made on June 1st. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Heiss. The gentleman yields back. Now we will turn to our first panel. Mr. Gregory T. Monahan is the acting chief of the United States Park Police. He's been with the Park Police or the Department of Interior Law Enforcement for over 23 years. Thank you very much, Chief, for being here today. I'll just remind the witness that under our committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but that your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there's 1 minute left and red when time is expired. I recommend that members joining remotely use active speaker thumbnail view so they may pin the timer on their screen and see members in the room. The chair now, again, thanking Chief Monahan for being here with us today, recognizes Acting Chief Monahan for his testimony. Sir, floor is yours.
Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the committee. My name is Gregory Monahan, and I'm the Acting Chief of Police for the United States Park Police. The United States Park Police is the oldest uniformed federal law enforcement agency in the United States and provides law enforcement services, including the protection of visitors and park resources to designated National Park Service areas, primarily in Washington, D.C., New York City, and San Francisco metropolitan areas. Here in Washington, that includes the National Mall in Lafayette Park on the north side of the White House at 8th Street between 15th and 17th Street Northwest. Each year, the United States Park Police facilitates hundreds of First Amendment demonstrations and special events in and around the district, some with permits and some with not, to ensure the safety of the public and the protection of national cultural assets. In facilitating these demonstrations, the Park Police partners and coordinates with numerous public safety and protection agencies within the national capital area. In the days following the death of George Floyd, videos from witnesses and CCTV became public and ultimately led to protests in cities throughout the United States and abroad. The district became a focal point for demonstrators, and one of the most highly concentrated areas of protest was in and around Lafayette Park, which is recognized as a public forum for speech and assembly. The Park Police is accustomed to managing large and occasionally unruly public demonstrations and spontaneous events at Lafayette Park, as well as throughout the national capital area. In these instances, we have an obligation to protect the safety of peaceful demonstrators, maintain law and order, and keep our law enforcement officers safe. Beginning on Friday, May 29, public use of Lafayette Park became a danger to public safety, good order, and health, and was inconsistent with the preservation of National Park Service resources. Violent demonstrations occurred between May 29 and June 1 and included projectiles aimed at law enforcement officers, including bricks, rocks, caustic substances, frozen water bottles, lit flares, fireworks, and 2x4 sections of lumber. Protesters were physically combative with members of law enforcement. The violent protesters injured 50 officers from the United States Park Police alone. 11 of my officers were transported to area hospitals, and 3 of them were ultimately admitted. The unprecedented and sustained nature of violence and destruction associated with some of the activities in Lafayette Park and the surrounding areas required de-escalation. And late Saturday evening on May 30 into Sunday morning, May 31, the U.S. Park Police, in consultation with our partners from the Secret Service, decided to temporarily restrict access to the park and the adjacent streets and sidewalks by ordering and installing anti-scale fencing across the north side of Lafayette Park. The installation of the fence met resource and protection de-escalation goals while enabling First Amendment activity to continue. Once we made that decision, installation of the fence was dependent on 2 factors. First, we were required to have sufficient resources on scene to safely clear Lafayette Park and H Street. And second, the fencing had to be present at the park. Both of these requirements were not met until later in the day on Monday, June 1. Once the fencing arrived and an on-the-ground assessment of the violence and danger presented by the crowd led to the clearing of the park and the installation of the fence. The Park Police has faced a significant amount of criticism on the heels of the June 1 operation. However, the installation of the no-scale fence on the north side of Lafayette Park was a key tactic that served to greatly de-escalate the violent behavior of bad actors. Violence dropped dramatically on June 2nd and afterward in that area, and First Amendment activities continued. In this case, I believe the United States Park Police acted with tremendous restraint in the face of severe violence from a large group of bad actors who again caused 50 of my officers to seek medical attention. Our actions that day centered around public safety and the safety of my officers, and the decision to install the fencing was in furtherance of that commitment towards de-escalation. Thank you, and I look forward to answering questions the committee may have.
For the testimony, reminding the members of the rule, imposing a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair on our side of the dais will recognize the chairs of the subcommittees and then proceed on a first-come, first-served basis going forward. With that, let me turn to Mr. Huffman for your 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Monahan, welcome. You have spoken a lot in your testimony about the time frame from George Floyd's murder until June 1, and you've talked with respect to Lafayette Park about the period between, your words, between May 29th and June the 1st. This committee and this hearing is focused entirely on June the 1st, and the chronology matters. Are you suggesting that some of these violent incidents by protesters, the throwing of caustic liquids and bricks and projectiles and harming officers, occurred on June the 1st?
So yes, sir, I am. On June 1st and throughout that operational period, we saw sustained violence from a number of bad actors in Lafayette Park and on H Street.
Can you provide this committee with documentation of that? Because that directly contradicts other firsthand evidence that we have, including video evidence.
Yes, sir. Any request for any documents, I'm happy to facilitate.
We want to see everything you've got on that. Now, did that happen before or after 6:35 p.m. when your officers and others began advancing on the protesters?
Yes, so the level of violence that we were subjected to on June 1st was...
No. Very direct question. Did the violence that you're referring to happen before 6:35 p.m.?
Yes, sir. No, I understand the question. And the violence that we were subjected to was throughout the entire operational period.
All right, thank you. And again, we really do want to see that evidence, sir. Mr. Monahan, you've been with the Park Police for a long time, so you are surely familiar with the settlement your agency entered into in 2015 after 13 years of litigation. You ended up paying millions of dollars to almost 400 peaceful protesters that you had advanced on with forceful means. And as part of that legal settlement, the service police was required to make very specific policy changes. Are you familiar with that settlement?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record that 2015 settlement agreement. At the top of page 8, that agreement requires the Park Police to update its procedure to provide audible warnings to protesters to disperse. And there are 4 significant parts of that legally enforceable commitment that your agency made. The first is officers must be positioned in the rear of the crowd so that they can actually hear the warnings that are given before the police advance. The second is that they need to use sound amplification as needed. And third, that they need to warn the protesters that they are in violation of a specific law. There's a substantive requirement as part of that warning. And fourth, maybe most significantly for June 1st, the arresting officers positioned in the rear of the crowd are required to give a verbal and/or physical indication to the officers in the front who were giving that warning so that your officers can confirm that it was audible and that it had been heard by the protesters. Were all of these procedures followed on June 1st?
The objective of June 1st is
All right, I just want to get your direct answer, and you say that every one of those procedures was followed. I'm going to ask to play a video that we believe suggests otherwise, Mr. Chief, and so I'd like to ask staff to play the clip entitled Warning 1.
A voice on a loudspeaker briefly cuts through the noise. The announcement appears to come from the southeast part of the park. Even on the front lines of the protest, in footage reviewed by the Post, the words are drowned out. Protesters turn to one another in confusion.
Mr. Monahan, could you understand the warning that was recorded in this video? Could you hear it? Was it audible to you?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
You must have superhuman hearing because I don't think any of us could hear it. And wouldn't you agree, just from our own lion eyes, we can see protesters who were clearly confused, who didn't appear to be told that they were about to be advanced on, who didn't appear to be told that they were in violation of a specific law as your settlement requires. Do you feel that that was understood by those protesters as evidenced by that video footage?
So I think when you take into account video footage, there's context. And based on other video that I've viewed from June 1st and specifically around this time frame when the first warning was given, throughout the first warning through the third warning, you can see a number of demonstrators leave the area and heed the warning that was given from the incident commander that.
All right. Well, Chief Monahan, we do look forward to getting the evidence that backs up your account of this. But Mr. Chair, from everything we've heard, from everything we've seen, it sure appears as if the Park Police ignored their own legal requirements in the settlement to follow these procedures, almost as if they wanted the crowd to be confused so that they could go in with maximum force and perhaps appease a president who just hours earlier had urged police to act that way. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Let me recognize Mr. Westerman for your 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Monahan, thank you for your testimony. You know, this is a hearing is about politics, and I apologize to you and the rest of the officers in the United States Park Police for having to endure a political attack. This is not the first hearing we've had on this. It probably won't be the last hearing. If my colleagues across the aisle were concerned about police reform, I don't think their colleagues in the Senate would have described Senator Tim Scott's bill as a token bill. I don't think the Speaker would have dismissed it as attempted murder or whatever word she used about Senator Scott's bill. We're here today to find out facts, not to play politics with a serious situation. This, my colleagues are supporting defunding the police. They seem to have no problem with defacing public property. And we all agree that Americans are allowed to protest peaceably, like the Constitution says. So the question is, were these peaceful protests or were they violent protests? You've testified that 50 of your officers were injured. Can you describe some of those injuries?
Yes, sir. Like I said in my opening statement, 50 U.S. Park Police officers were injured between May 29th and June 1st. On May 29th, we had 13 officers that were injured during violent protests at Lafayette Park and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. 11 of those injuries were blunt trauma-related injuries to the head, upper body, and lower body. One of those injuries was sustained by a sergeant from the United States Park Police who was wearing this helmet here on the table. He was struck in the helmet by a brick that was thrown at him by a violent protester. And you can see the damage that had occurred to the left side of this helmet that is sitting here on the table. That officer was later hospitalized. To this date, he has still not returned to work. On May 30th, there were 37 injuries up at the White House. 20 of those were for the U.S. Park Police, and those injuries were blunt trauma-related injuries to the head, upper body, and lower body. The most significant of which was an officer from the United States Park Police who was on the line on the north end of Lafayette Park, and he was struck in the testicles by a protester who threw a brick and struck him in the groin. He suffered a significant injury. He just returned to work this past Sunday. On May 31st, we had 16 patient encounters of U.S. Park Police personnel. 6 of those were blunt trauma-related injuries to the head, upper body, and lower body. And on June 1st, we only had 1 injury. An officer was punched in the face by a protester when we were clearing H Street, and he suffered a facial laceration.
I find it hard to see how anybody could call that a peaceful protest. And was the protocol followed to give 3 warnings? And what kind of device was used to do that?
Yes, sir, the protocol was followed to give 3 warnings, the first of which was given at 6:23 p.m. There were 3 warnings given, and they were given utilizing a long-range acoustic device. It's called an LRAD, and that's what it stands for. That was the device used.
I just want to get some things straight for the record here. Did Attorney General Barr order the Park Police to clear the square?
No, sir, he did not.
Did White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows order the Park Police to clear the square?
No.
Did anyone at the White House order the Park Police to clear the square?
No, sir.
Did Secretary Bernhardt order the Park Police to clear the square?
No, he did not.
It seems pretty cut and dry to me what happened. I wish that Congress could work on renewing hope in America, on restoring the America that we love, and work on overcoming this pandemic and rebuilding our future rather than continuing to drag issues like this through the mud when it's clear that my colleagues across the aisle do not want to work for a solution. A very thoughtful bipartisan bill was put out on police reform by Senator Scott, and it was essentially laughed at. With that, I yield back.
Yields. Let me now turn to Vice Chair of the committee, Ms. Holland, for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Monahan. I'd like to talk about the missing Park Police radio recordings from June 1st. Mr. Monahan, did the Park Police communicate over radio with other agencies regarding the orders and coordination of June 1st that we're talking about today?
In terms of the radio transmissions made by the United States Park Police, they were to other members of the United States Park Police. We had face-to-face contact with partner agencies on June 1st.
So just to be clear, the radio communication was just between the Park Police, and any other communications between other agencies were in person?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is it standard procedure for Park Police to record radio transmissions between each other like this?
Yes, so standard procedure for every incident is to have a record of any radio transmissions.
And can you explain to us why the radio transmissions should be recorded?
Yes, ma'am. If you go back to September of 2018, the United States Park Police were utilizing an analog radio system at the time. We were preparing to transition to a digital radio format. In September of 2018, we experienced a critical failure in our analog radio system. We transitioned to the digital format. When our radio technicians were conducting this transference, only our main radio channel was configured to record. Our administrative channel that we utilize for large special events, such as the one on June 1st, was not configured to record at the time.
So it was not configured to record at the time. Are there radio recordings of the Park Police for the time period between May 29th and June 2nd at all?
So for our normal operations, yes, but not for the special event and the demonstration at the White House.
And I'm sorry, why is that?
So again, when we transitioned to our digital radio system, the radio technicians that were setting up that system only set up our main dispatch channel to record. They did not, it was an error, they did not set up our administrative channel to record.
Okay, so that was an error, you say?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Were there any notes or logs of those transmissions? Because there was an error in having those communications recorded?
Yes, so for any special event, a large special event or demonstration like the one on June 1st, we establish a written record or a written log of transmissions that are utilized within the command bus to send out situational reports or updates via email. So that was done in this case.
And so can you provide any notes or logs of those transmissions to the committee, please?
So I will work with the department's Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs on any requests that you have.
And is it regular practice to take such notes or logs, or does it only happen when you know the radio recording is not working?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I mentioned earlier, for large special events or demonstrations like we had on June 1st and the days leading up to June 1st, we establish a redundant process of having a written log.
Okay. So is it standard procedure to record radio transmissions, but there is no recording of radio traffic from Park Police for June 1st, which just happens to be the day the administration did a test run of the brutal crackdown on protesters we continue to see now in cities across America? And I would imagine having that recording would answer many of the questions that we and the public have at this moment.
Yes, ma'am, and I agree. I think every incident should have a complete record. And in this instance, we have a written record.
Okay, and so you will provide that written record to the committee at your earliest convenience?
Yes, again, I'll work with the Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs on fulfilling your request.
Regarding your radio recording technology, well, you're saying it wasn't actually broken. It was just, it was an error on the part of, it was an error in making sure that the recordings actually recorded. So it wasn't set up that way. So it wasn't really broken. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we did not recognize the error until we attempted to pull the radio run on June 10th. We have since, as soon as we were alerted to the fact that it was not configured to record, we have corrected that error.
Okay. And I'm sorry, whose fault was the error?
So if you go back to September of 2018, the radio technicians, it was an oversight on their part, and they did not configure the administrative channel to record.
Okay.
But as I said, every incident should have a complete record, and in this instance, we have a written log.
Okay. And so, so right now you have the radio the recordings are working. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes, ma'am.
So if we were to have a repeat of June 1st, we would have the recordings that you could send over to us?
Yes, our administrative channel is configured to record, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. I'm sorry. I yield.
Mr. Heiss, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the long-range acoustic device that was used. What is the range of that device when it comes to warning the crowd?
Sir, it's been some time since I read the actual specs of the long-range acoustic device, but I want to say it's 600 meters.
Okay, were the protesters within that range?
Yes, I would estimate that they were where we had it set up, which was we were in the center of the park and on the the northeast section of the center of the park. And I would say we were within 45 meters of the protesters.
So they were in range of hearing. We also know that protesters must have the ability to leave an area. What courses of actions did the park police consider when discussing that issue?
Yes, sir. So when implementing our plan to clear the north side of Lafayette Park and H Street, we moved the crowd from east to west, and then their path of exit was either north on 16th Street towards India Street, or continued west to 17th and H, or Connecticut and H.
So that is the direction that the officers were pushing the protesters?
That was the movement from east to west, correct?
Okay. Were the protesters in any way prevented from leaving the square by police?
No, they were not.
Okay. You mentioned earlier the various acts of violence, the projectiles that were being thrown, and the injuries that were sustained. There was everything from frozen water bottles to bricks, caustic liquids, and a weekend of violent protest. You mentioned 51 officers injured. Of course, we know about the arsons at the St. John's Church and so forth. We also know from intelligence reports that there were calls by police officers regarding violence against them. There were also caches found of glass bottles, baseball bats, metal poles along the way. I'm curious, from the time from then to now, has there been any type of investigation to see whether or not there were any specific groups or a group that was involved in organizing all of this?
Yes, so the United States Park Police has coordinated with a number of our federal partners in follow-up investigations on some of the violence that we saw, the assaults on officers. We've been successful in obtaining a number of arrest warrants for individuals that were either involved in assaults against police officers or damage to park resources. In terms of a nexus to larger groups, that's an ongoing effort.
When do you think that may be determined?
Yeah, I don't know if I could say as I sit here today. Again, these are ongoing investigations, and as we gather more information and as additional arrests are made, all of the intel that's gathered from those arrests contributes to any nexus to a larger effort.
It just appears that in some other places throughout the country, there are specific groups that are behind it. I was curious if that was the same here, but that investigation is still underway, is what you're saying.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Recently, there was a video that circulated that shows Representative Jerry Nadler, of course, chairman of the Judiciary, stating that many of these protests were, in essence, a myth as far as the violence within the protests. Would you agree with that?
No, sir, I would not agree. I think based on the level of violence and sustained violence that we saw beginning on May 29th through June 1st, this was one of the most violent protests that I've been a part of in my 23 years with the United States Park Police.
One of the most. What would be another one that would rank up there in your memory?
The Occupy DC demonstrations from several years ago, and then the World Bank demonstrations.
Okay. It just is amazing to me that we are, as Representative Westerman mentioned, this is just nothing more than political theater to come here and somehow pretend as though these were peaceful protesters, where the evidence is abundant. Everything from arson to vandalism to 51 injured officers. This was anything but peaceful, and the reason it did not sustain that kind of momentum in Washington, D.C. is because the Parks Police and others got involved to put a stop to it. And so I want to thank you for your service in that regard in maintaining the safety of Washington, D.C. and beyond. We are appreciative of that. And Mr. Chairman, before I yield, I do have a letter from the federal law enforcement officers that I would ask unanimous consent to have submitted to the record. Thank you, sir. I yield.
I ask Mr. Lowenthal you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Acting Chief Monahan, for being here. The questions that I have are to Mr. Monahan have to do with the reasons given for clearing the protesters from Lafayette Square. I think you mentioned that one of the reasons was that the area was needed to be cleared to put up fencing to seal off Lafayette Park and create a new perimeter. When was that decision made? And was there any specific time when this fencing was supposed to go up?
Yes, sir. So the decision to pursue other options based on the increased level of violence that we saw beginning on May 29th was initially discussed Saturday evening into Sunday morning. Based on a number of factors, we knew that we were likely going to have on Monday a late report time for our personnel, but also a late arrival time for the fencing. The fencing did arrive on Monday in the late afternoon. At 3 p.m. on Monday, the site manager arrived. At 3:30, the employees arrived. The fencing arrived at 5:15 p.m. and then was staged on 17th Street by the United States Secret Service. As I spoke earlier, at 6:23 p.m., we gave the first of 3 warnings. The initial movement to clear the north side of Lafayette Park and H Street was commenced at 6:30 p.m. and it was concluded at 6:50 p.m. At 6:55, the Secret Service escorted the trucks with the fencing inside the White House area and staged them on the west side of Lafayette Park at Jackson Place. And they began to install the fence at 7:30 p.m. and the fencing build out was completed at 12:50 a.m.
Let me understand. You said in the this operation about the fencing that it happening in the early evening was inevitable, given that you needed both the resources and the fencing to do this. Was there ever any discussion that it would be better to start this process of fencing after the curfew or at night to start it instead of in the evening when the crowd was going to be at its peak? What's the standard of timing for setting up security fencing and a new perimeter?
So in this particular instance, we were not necessarily operating on a timeline. We were operating on the need for logistical strength in the terms of having ample resources to safely implement our plan and then having the fencing in place. In terms of the curfew, that was not something that factored into our decision making. And if you look at the level of violence that we were subjected to over the three previous operational periods, it increased throughout the day. And then as nightfall came upon us, it increased even from that point on. So if the previous night was any indication, which was the first night where we had the curfew, waiting until curfew did not appear likely that the rioters in the crowd would peacefully disperse.
So let me just understand this. In his statement, Major DeMarco also mentioned that shortly after Attorney General Barr left Lafayette Square at 6:20 after conferring with the Park Police, the inaudible warnings began. Shortly after the clearing finished in a fast-paced and rushed manner, about 30 minutes later, the president was having his photo op at about 7:05 p.m. Now, I need to understand, either the clearing was for a photo op or that's an amazing coincidence, don't you think, Mr. Monahan?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence. Our operation was solely centered around the clearing of H Street and the north end of Lafayette Park to de-escalate the sustained level of violence that we saw over the previous 3 days, and then again on June 1st. In order to do that, in order to successfully de-escalate that, A common practice is to install physical barriers or boundaries between protesters and law enforcement. And in this case, the best avenue to do that was to install that anti-scale fencing. And to my point, if you fast forward to June 2nd, we saw a dramatic decrease in violent behavior at Lafayette Park on June 2nd.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield back, but it just strikes me as an amazing coincidence. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back 5 minutes to Mr. Heiss.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Let's talk about this fence. The Democrats' second witness submitted written testimony that the materials to erect the fence did not arrive on the scene till around 9 p.m. Can you confirm that testimony? If not, what time did the material arise and the fence start being erected?
Yes, sir. So Mr. DeMarco was mistaken. The fencing, as I said earlier, the site manager arrived at 3. The employees arrived at 3:30. The first truck with the fencing arrived at 5:15. But they staged on 17th Street south of Pennsylvania Avenue. They were escorted into the White House complex, if you will, at 6:55, and that was after we cleared the north end of Lafayette Park and H Street. And at 7:30, they began to build the fence, 7:30 p.m.
All right, so the testimony of the next witness is not accurate as it relates to the fence. Since the time that the fence was put up, how many officers have been injured?
Oh, so after the fencing was built out, we had 0 injuries from U.S. Park Police officers.
All right, so why does Lafayette Park remain closed?
So the fencing was taken down shortly after, I think June 10th, it was taken down. We saw sort of a second phase of violence in D.C. that was directed at statues and other federal property. And Lafayette Park was closed down through the 31st of this month in an effort to restore and repair some of the damage that was done in Lafayette Park.
It seems clear to me that fencing is effective in deterring vandals. Would you agree with that?
In this case, just based on the geography, it was a meaningful and deliberate move and a change in tactics on our part in furtherance of de-escalation. So yes, it did work.
Yeah, it did work. You've had 0 injuries since then. I think the evidence speaks for itself. Is there currently a fence around St. John's Church?
There is anti-scale fencing around a portion of St. John's Church, yes.
Has there been any further damage or vandalism done to the church since the fence was erected around the church?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to my knowledge either. So who requested this fence to be erected?
So the concept or the idea of utilizing anti-scale fencing was a conversation that we had between the U.S. Park Police and our counterparts with the United States Secret Service. And again, that discussion began Saturday evening into Sunday morning.
According to your testimony, the fence was a key tactic that served to greatly reduce the violent behavior of bad actors. And from your testimony here this morning, it was effective in accomplishing that strategic mission. The Park Police has an obligation to protect the safety of peaceful demonstrators while at the same time maintaining law and order. We get that. And we've got to protect our law enforcement officers. And so how does the erection of the fence in this case and in other cases help accomplish these obligations?
Yes, so it's a good question. It's a physical barrier. And what we saw on the days preceding it, so on the 29th, 30th, and the 31st, the barriers that we had between protesters and law enforcement in the park were 2 rows of bike rack, which is maybe 4 feet high. And we had numerous successful attempts of demonstrators jumping over the bike rack that was lined with police tape to not cross. Erecting an anti-scale fence is a was a logical move and a change in tactic to prevent those type of behaviors. It did not prevent projectiles from continuing to be thrown in the days subsequent to that, but it provided a suitable barrier between law enforcement and those bad actors that were showing their violence towards law enforcement.
Well, let me ask you this, my final question here. Who specifically were the personnel involved in the actual installation of the fence? Were the National Guardsmen who were part of the detail installing the fence? Who was it?
No, it was the fencing company itself installed the fencing.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield.
Gentleman yields, and let me now recognize Mr. Gallegos for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Acting Chief, who ordered the clearing on June 1st? Who told the men advance?
I'm sorry, your second question?
Who told the men to advance on the crowd?
So the order was given by the incident commander from the United States Park Police.
Right. Were you on site?
Yes, I was.
Did you have any conversations with Attorney General Barr on site?
No, I did not.
You did not at all interact with him when he came outside of the White House?
I saw him in the park, but I did not have any interaction with him.
Okay. So tell me again why you didn't wait till 7 p.m. because that actually sounds totally illogical to me. 7 p.m. you could actually make probably a statement saying now this is an illegal operation. You need to disperse because there's a curfew. But you decided to coincidentally 40 minutes earlier decide to do it because somehow you think that de-escalates.
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned earlier, we were not operating on a timetable.
But why didn't you? It actually makes more logical sense for you to wait till 7 p.m.
I would respectfully disagree, and I say that based on our experience the night before. And when the 7 p.m. curfew arrived the night before, no one left the area. So
but that day you only had one injury. What time was that injury at? When you testified June 1st, one injury. What time was that injury at?
The injury on June 1st was during the clearing operation of 8th Street.
So that whole day was peaceful testimony until the clearing, and yet you decided that somehow there was going to be violence, so therefore you initiated something before 7 p.m. curfew.
No, so that's inaccurate. What I stated earlier was that we saw violence throughout the operational period.
I'm not asking that. I'm asking on June 1st.
Yes.
Let me give you an example. When I was in the Marine Corps and I had to clear all these cities, I had to react to what was happening that day. I may have gotten shot at, thrown at, tried to be mortared, IED. It actually happened every day. The next day, I went out and patrolled like a professional. On June 1st, by your testimony, you had largely peaceful protesters up until the time you actually forcibly tried to move them. Your decision-making process should have been based on the ground and what was happening on that day.
All of our decisions on June 1st were based on an on-the-ground assessment of the level of violence that was directed at law enforcement.
But
My
not of that
testimony
day.
today
But not of that day.
No, sir, that's inaccurate.
That is very unprofessional if you were actually telling me that you made decisions of June 1st, what to do June 1st, and you decided that that day required a level of escalation because later on, one person would get injured once you start moving through the crowd.
So my testimony to you today is our operation on June 1st was solely based on an effort to de-escalate the violence, and it was based on an effort to provide for the safety of those.
No, you claim that you want to de-escalate the violence by putting the fence up, which I actually agree with. That's actually a very good move, and I think that was important to actually de-escalating. But de-escalating the violence does not mean sending, men swinging their batons and using pepper spray or CS gas, whatever you guys claimed it to be, 40 minutes prior to a curfew. It just doesn't make logical sense. Anybody who, and I actually have been trained in de-escalation, I have been trained in riot control also. The one thing you try to do is you try to find the moments to actually de-escalate. So 7 p.m., when the curfew is about to hit, when you're probably going to have some backing, at least maybe from the Washington Police Department, would have been the most logical sense. Instead, we have this weird scenario that you're telling me that there was so much violence that day that nobody was injured, by the way, until you guys advanced on them, that you had to make that decision then. It makes no sense. If I had acted this way when I was in the Marine Corps, I probably would have been busted down a couple of reps. Also, there was 2 police officers that assaulted Australian TV news crew. Are they being held responsible?
Yes, so the incident on June 1st involving the Australian media is being investigated by the Office of Professional Responsibility for the United States Park Police. That investigation is underway at this time.
Did you see the video yourself?
I have seen the video, yes.
Was the conduct professional that these police officers were engaging in?
So it's an ongoing investigation, and it would be inappropriate for me to comment on that officially.
And just to be clear, your police officers that day on June 1st, they were all park police officers. There wasn't, people weren't brought in for ICE or DHS. That was all park police.
On June 1st, we were operating under unified command with the United States Secret Service.
No, I get that. And after I was here, who were the people that were assaulting and pushing forward on the protesters? Were they all park police?
No, the other agencies that have assisted with the operation and the clearing of H Street and the north end of Lafayette Park.
You cleared protesters with people that have different standards, different procedures for clearing. Because you train your park police all along one standard, right, in terms of riot control. Did you know what standards and procedures those other elements were used to?
Yes, they receive the same training that we do.
They do?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you provide documentation for that?
I'm sorry?
Can you provide documentation for that?
Yeah, any requests you have, I will facilitate and work with the Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs from the department on addressing.
I yield back.
Mr. Cox, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you so much for being here today, Chief. You know, the hearing today isn't so much about whether or not the fence went up or people were painting in the park or peaceful protest. Well, in fact, it really was peaceful protest. It's whether or not that the park police and yourself really have a duty and obligation and a fealty to the Constitution. Chief, I'm sure that you and your officers take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution.
Yes, sir.
And if you were given an order to, forcefully bear blacks or women from voting at polling places, would you abide by that order?
I'm sorry, sir. Can you repeat the question?
If you were given an order to forcefully bear women or African Americans from polling places, would you abide by that order?
I'm not sure I understand your question, sir.
Let me ask you another question. If you were given an order to have your officers forcefully take firearms away from law-abiding citizens, would you abide by that order?
Again, I don't know the context in which you're asking the question, I guess.
It's going to get down to the point that if you and your officers are asked to violate the very First Amendment of the Constitution, which allows people to peacefully assemble, would you abide by that order?
So on June 1st, there were peaceful demonstrators on H Street and there were bad actors on H Street. When we gave the first of 3 warnings, those were warnings that we were clearing this area for safety reasons and it was a temporary closure. Once that 3rd warning was given, everyone on the north end of Lafayette Park and H Street is required to vacate that area. When we did the operation from east to west to clear H Street, we gave them avenues of exit.
Well, I think, thanks very much. We've heard that explanation. And we're going to hear from the next witness, right, that what they were asked to do was contravene their oath to the Constitution, all right? And what we're being asked today, and what you're basically testifying to, is that there was no correlation at all between your orders to clear the square and with the president's photo op. Now, would you agree, or tell me otherwise, did the park need to be cleared in order for the president to take his photo op?
So our goal that day was...
No. Would you answer that question? Did that park need to be cleared? Did that area need to be vacated by any other citizens for the president to take his photo?
So we did not clear the park for a photo op. We cleared the park for public safety reasons.
That's not the question. Whether or not you did. Did it need to be cleared? In your professional opinion, and you're not with the Secret Service, but did that area need to be cleared in order for the president to march from the White House to Lafayette Square to take a photo in front of St. John Square?
And I don't think I'm the person to answer that question. Our focus was on public safety. You're a
national citizen. You've been around. Would you think that the place needed to be cleared?
And
And it
I'm
was
only
just a
here to
convenient
speak to-
coincidence. You see, I mean, I hope you can appreciate how, I mean, it begs to reason that the place would have to be cleared. And all of a sudden, as my colleague, Mr. Lowenthal, was saying, that just magically, right, and very coincidentally, that area was cleared. And you just happened to be doing that because fencing absolutely had to go up right at 6:30 because you've been waiting, because contractors were making overtime.
So our focus that day was to install that fencing. And as I spoke earlier, the timing of that
And so
was
there
somewhat
was,
fluid.
so what you're absolutely testifying, and I'd like you to make this statement, that there was absolutely no correlation, no direction to clear the square for the president's photo op.
There is 100% zero
Okay?
correlation between our operation and the president's visit to the church.
Okay. Now, and so what would have the president have done if if the square hadn't been cleared? Would he have gone out there?
I don't know if I can answer that question respectfully, sir.
Okay. And so, as I said, we're going to hear from our next witness about why he has come forward to testify today, because what he was asked to do is to contravene his oath to the Constitution. Do your officers ever get any training when they're put into these types of situations, when they're asked to contravene their oath and their duties to the Constitution, when they're given an order that they can't abide by?
So I believe every action taken by the United States Park Police on June 1st.
No. Are they ever
was
given
just
any
action.
training with regard to that situation, when they're put into an untenable situation like that?
I wouldn't characterize the situation as untenable.
Okay. Thanks so much for your time.
Someone yields back. Mr. Gosar, you recognize, sir?
Thank you. Boy, this is like living in Groundhog's Day, an alternative universe. The other side is on a fishing expedition here, trying to get you to say something very different, Chief. Now, a real quick question to you, quick yes or no. As your officers worked to clear Lafayette Square, were they aware that the mob had attempted to burn down St. John's Church?
Yes.
So is that an exercise of the First Amendment, burning down a church?
No, sir, it's not.
Interesting. So now in Lafayette Square, your officers were facing off against violent anarchists who spent the better part of several days there. True?
Yes, sir, that's accurate.
Defacing the World War II memorial, a remembrance of grateful nation to all who served actually during the fighting, fascism. Damaging the Lincoln Memorial, a tribute to the Republican president who led a nation to end slavery and saving our union. Tearing down monuments around the city and attempting to burn down and deface the historic St. John's Church. Meanwhile, as your officers on foot attempted to push these anarchists away from the White House, their real target to destroy and deface, they were pelted with water bottles, fireworks, and called some of the most vile, disgusting names directly to their faces. Yet at all times, your officers behaved by all reports responsibly and worked in a tremendous professional manner. Now that the area has been cleared, I have a few questions about the statutes on Lafayette Square. Chief, counter to the narrative being pushed by the media, Lafayette Square was cleared in order to allow for a fence to be erected. The fence was put up as a means to enhance security at the square. In the time since the fence has been put up, how many officers have been injured?
There have been no injuries sustained by the United States Park Police since the fence was put up on June 1st.
Once again, I want to ask, why does Lafayette Square remain closed?
So currently it's closed due to ongoing restoration efforts and damage assessments based on the damage to the statues and other areas within the park, to include the confrontation that was burned down in the days preceding June 1st.
So once again, First Amendment, does it allow you to desecrate, destroy, and defame public property?
No, sir, it does not.
Wow. But I keep hearing that it's a peaceful demonstration. Do you keep hearing that too?
Yes, sir.
That's that alternative universe again. Is there currently a fence around St. John's Church, the church in which a fire was lit the night before the square was cleared?
Yes, there's currently fencing around the front of the church.
Who requested that fence to be erected?
Metropolitan Police from DC.
Since fence has been put up, has there been any further destruction or vandalism of the church?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
So now, according to your written testimony, the fence was a key tactic that served to greatly reduce the violent behavior of the bad actors, and that violence dropped off dramatically. The Park Police has an obligation to protect the safety of peaceful demonstrators, maintain law and order, and keep our law enforcement officers safe. How does the fence help promote those obligations?
I'm sorry, your last part?
How does the fence help you keep those obligations?
Yes, I mean, based on the previous day's violence, it was clear to us that the longer we waited to install the fence, the likelihood that the situation would get worse on June 1st. We saw acts of violence on June 1st throughout the day. We saw projectiles being thrown at officers. We had angry protesters and rioters attempt to, and in some cases, jump over the double row of bike rack on the north side of the park. Our assessment from those that were on the ground who witnessed the previous day's violence and were faced with the violence in front of them on that day was that the aggression from the crowd, the increased aggression that got even worse after 7 p.m. and the curfew, even though we were not abiding by a curfew, was that to erect that fence was a logical next step for de-escalation.
Now, I think everybody here at the dais would say that we want to make sure that we protect a citizen's right to protest peacefully. Can you describe the typical role Park Police plays during these protests and marches?
Yes, our goal for any demonstration is to provide for the safety of those that are there to peacefully assemble, to protect the resources, to maintain law and order, to ensure that any lawful demonstration can continue uninterrupted, but also to ensure the safety of our personnel.
What we're seeing is anarchism. We're seeing desecration and hiding behind people claiming for peaceful assembly. I yield back.
Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a New York Times article from June 18th, 2020, entitled "Park Police Head Had Been Accused of Illegal Searches and Unreliable Testimony." This is an article about Mr. Monahan. Mr. Monahan, I want to get your reaction to additional video from June 1st. These clips show the moments immediately before and then during the law enforcement surge around 6:30 p.m., a half hour before the Washington, D.C. curfew went into effect. Please pay particular attention to whether the police were responding to any actual physical threats from the crowd, the speed and aggression of the police surge, and the weapons officers used on the protesters. Can the committee staff please play the clips? I believe there's one more.
A Park Police officer strikes an Australian cameraman with a shield and grabs his camera. Another officer is seen swinging a baton at reporters' back as she and the cameraman flee.
Mr. Monahan, our time is limited, so I ask that you please answer these questions with a simple yes or no. Were the officers that we saw surging against the crowd and assaulting a news crew? Yes or no? The officers you saw in those clips, were they surging against the crowd and assaulting a news crew? Yes or no?
So again,
That's not yes or no, Mr. Monahan. I'm just asking you yes or no.
And respectfully, I don't think I can answer it with a yes or no.
So it's your contention they weren't surging against the crowd? They weren't assaulting a news crew? Picture speaks 1,000 words.
Sure, and I think that the video shows a moment in time As to the second video, I will not comment on it. It's an ongoing investigation.
Yeah, I've heard you say that. Did the clip show any violence from the protesters before the officers surged on them? Simple yes or no.
And again, I don't think there's a simple yes or no. If you look at the first video that you showed,
I think we all saw the video, and I think we'd acknowledge that there was no such violence. And look, the administration has contradicted itself on whether the alleged violence was actually the reason for the use of force. Other statements, including from Attorney General Barr, said the area was cleared to move the perimeter 1 block. I think we've seen statements that water bottles and such were thrown, but it's obviously not justification for such a response. Did you see the officers shove protesters with their shields in that video? Again, simply yes or no.
I saw the video that you showed, and it shows officers clearing 8th Street.
So that's a yes. So we're getting somewhere. That's good. Did you see officers attack reporters, one of whom was an Australian correspondent, Amelia Brace, who testified at our last hearing, even as they tried to get away? Again, yes or no?
And again, respectfully, I won't comment on an ongoing investigation.
Well, it was on the video that happened, and we heard from Ms. Brace that it happened. Did you see officers throw or fire chemical munitions into the crowd?
Yes, I did.
Thank you for acknowledging that. And did officers throw flashbang or stinger ball grenades into the crowd?
Yes, and our rules of engagement dictated on June 1st that we would only use force if we were met with violent resistance.
And did we see any of that violent resistance in those videos, Mr. Monahan?
And again, looking at a video.
It's a simple yes or no question.
Not in the context of the video that you showed, sir.
So that's a no. So are you willing to tell this committee and the American people that the force those officers used against the crowd was not excessive and unjustified?
The use of force that the United States Park Police employed on June 1st was in line with our policies and procedures.
Well, I heard you in your introduction say that this was tremendous restraint used by your officers, and I just find that hard to believe. But do you stand by that statement based on the video we just saw that this was tremendous restraint?
Yes, sir, I do.
Well, I'll just remind my fellow colleagues of the title of that New York Times article from June 18th and ask you to read it. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Monahan, for being here today where we finally get to have a dialogue with you about the events of June 1st. My first question relates to the first video clip that I think Mr. Huffman had played at the beginning of the hearing. Did you see any violence on the part of the protesters in that brief clip?
So the video that was shown.
Yes or no, the first clip?
It captures a moment in time, and in that clip, you'd have to play it again for me.
It was a peaceful assembly that we saw per that clip. You mentioned that on June 1st, there was actually only one officer who regretfully had to be treated because of some injury, not 50, as you had stated previously, in over a several-day period. Do you know the circumstances of that treatment? What led to those injuries or his treatment?
Yes, so his injury was sustained during the clearing operation of 8th Street. During that clearing operation, he was engaged in a violent interaction with a protester, and he was punched in the face by the protester.
Fair enough. One officer. Do you know approximately the size of the crowd that had assembled at Lafayette Square?
So it varied throughout the day. I would say
at about 6:30, sir.
I would say several thousand people.
1,000, 50,000?
It was less than 50,000. I would estimate 1,000 to 3,000.
Good. Any guesstimate of what percent of those assembled were behaving in violent ways?
No, I don't.
Okay.
The only thing I can
Let the
testify
record
to
show
is
that you don't know. With respect to the use of tear gas, are you aware that tear gas is a chemical weapon banned in war?
No, I'm not aware of that.
I'm glad we're having this conversation. We've all seen the chilling images of peaceful demonstrators being attacked and gassed by federal law enforcement officers, including those under your command. And it should never again be used against demonstrators, but especially not during a pandemic. That's why Representatives Takano and Ocasio have joined me in a bill that seeks to ban the use of this chemical agent, especially during a pandemic against peaceful demonstrators. Mr. Monahan, do you believe in the First Amendment and people's right to organize peacefully?
Yes, sir, of course I do.
Glad to hear that. Do you believe that people are reasonably upset over the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black lives taken by police officers?
Yes, sir.
And do you believe that demonstrators are in their right to take to the streets after persistent police brutality against communities of color?
I believe that individuals have the right to peacefully assemble and demonstrate, yes.
Then why were you on board with the eagerness to disperse the crowd when it was maybe 30 minutes before the curfew was to take effect, a curfew that people were quite well aware of by the time of this violent encounter in Lafayette Square? What was so urgent about things when we saw video that the protesters were in fact largely peaceful, and one of the witnesses that has appeared before this committee, the head of the church that was referred to earlier, said that they were participating and the members of that church were participating in peaceful actions, and that it included many gatherings of family members, including children, that were participating in their right to free speech.
So to your first question, the United States Park Police did not use tear gas on June 1st. To your second question, were there people there peacefully demonstrating? Yes, but there were a number of bad actors. And once the 3 warnings were given, everyone there needed to vacate that area.
But were there other chemical agents that your forces used?
Yes, our rules of engagement specifically prohibited the use of CS gas on June 1st. We utilized pepper ball, we utilized smoke canisters, which do not have an irritant in them, and we also used stinger balls.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think my time has run out, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I recognize Ms. Velasquez for her time. With us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Monahan, did you have any communications from President Trump, Vice President Pence, Attorney General Barr, or Secretary Esper encouraging you not to testify on June 29?
No, ma'am.
Have you ever had conversations with a subordinate encouraging them not to cooperate with this committee's investigation?
No.
Mr. Monahan, the USPP has a history of engaging in abusive powers during peaceful protest. A 2015 court-ordered settlement required the USPP to provide 3 audible warnings, at least 2 minutes apart, to disperse crowds and identify avenues for protesters to scatter. Did you comply with that, to identify through audible avenues for protesters to scatter?
Yes, ma'am. As we discussed earlier, there were 3 warnings given, And in terms of an avenue to leave the area, the way the crowd was moved, they could either go north on 16th Street to I-India Street or continue west on 8th Street to either Connecticut Avenue or 17th Street.
So that doesn't match the testimony of previous witnesses, nor the testimony that will be provided by Major Adam DeMarco regarding audible warnings. And we just saw the video that was played. And to say otherwise, it's just really outrageous. I was watching it. I couldn't hear anything. The people that were there even say, what were they saying? What did they mean? So, Mr. Monahan, you also watched the video of the female reporter, Ms. Brace. So my question to you is, any action by her, and she was standing there, weren't being attacked and shot at with rubber bullets?
So, ma'am, I take seriously any allegation of misuse of force by any of our members, and we have policies and procedures that direct how those things are handled. In this instance, there is a current internal affairs investigation that is underway, and that is, as I said, it's currently under investigation. If at the end of that investigation,
okay, so I'm
there's
asking you,
findings-
you saw, sir, reclaiming my time, I'm asking you, the video that was played, you watch it, I watch it. So was there any actions committed by Ms. Brace that required the type of action and attack by the police?
And again, as I stated earlier, I will not comment on an ongoing investigation. I will just commit to that we will be hold our officers accountable for any actions that are deemed a violation of force policy. And that investigation is still underway.
Mr. Monahan, are you aware that COVID-19 affects the respiratory system?
Yes, ma'am.
So why would you use any type of chemical agent in the midst of a pandemic?
And again, as I stated earlier, our rules of engagement on June 1st were that we would not use any force unless we were met with violent resistance from
My question to you is, why, knowing that this country is dealing with a pandemic and basically one of the areas most impacted by COVID-19 is the respiratory system, knowing that, why do you use such agents, chemical agents, against peaceful protesters?
And again, the use of force that we utilized was in response to the violent behavior exhibited by a number of bad actors that were in the midst of others that were there to peacefully assemble.
Well, as I mentioned to you before, sir, witnesses who came before this committee, Mayor Adam DeMarco, they are all testifying that those were peaceful protesters. That was covered amply by the media, widely. The nation was watching while they saw how the police attacked peaceful protesters. So immediately following the incident, the Arlington County Board Chair said that she was appalled that their cooperation agreement with the Trump administration has been abused to endanger their and others' safety for a photo op. And media reports indicate that the USPPP directly misled the Arlington County Police about the nature of the operation. How would you respond to the comments made by the board chair and the allegations that the USPP misled the Arlington County Police about the nature of the operation?
Yes, ma'am. So the United States Park Police enjoys a very long and storied history with the Arlington County Police Department in terms of mutual aid over the last numerous years. In terms of their assistance and their vital assistance to our operation on June 1st, that was a request that was made through mutual aid.
Sir,
In terms of
why
what
do
we
you
were asking
think,
for.
excuse me, why do you think that the chair
Time
of
has
the
expired.
board is saying that you misled them? Why do you think, is she implying that you lie to them?
Mr. Chairman, hasn't time expired?
Yep. You may answer
I
the
yield
last
back.
question. Gentlelady yields. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chief Monahan, for being here today. I come from a more rural part of the world, northeastern Pennsylvania, where we haven't had these types of violent interactions. In fact, all of our George Floyd demonstrations and protests have been peaceful, have been joined in with by the local police forces. So this is something new for me to jump into the world of these things. But I want to see if we can agree on some things. I suspect we will. You mentioned before that you said that you believe every incident should have a complete record, right?
Yes, sir.
And the idea is to not only to do the job, but to improve the way you do the job, to make sure regrettable incidents are not repeated, right?
Yes, that's a fair statement, yes.
And to do that, what we're looking for is accountability. I think you used the word yourself, Chief. We want accountability on the part of our police forces, including the park police, right?
Yes, I would agree.
And to do that, it is fitting and proper for us to engage in these exercises where we flesh out the facts of incidences. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so anybody who says that to flesh out the facts of a violent confrontation between police and protesters is some sort of political charade, some kind of a show, that's not necessarily true. What we're looking for is fleshing out the facts to find accountability, and that's a good thing, isn't it, Chief?
In terms of fleshing out for accountability, yes, I would agree.
Absolutely. Well, all right. What I want to do is I want to go over some of your testimony from this morning. And again, I thank you for being here and going through this. One of the things I wanted to clear up was Congressman Lowenthal asked you a question about whether it was a coincidence between the timing of the clearing of Lafayette Square and the photo op that the White House engaged in. And you said it was not a coincidence. And I don't think that's what you meant, and I want to give you a chance to clear that up.
Our decision and the timing of implementing our plan to clear the north side of Lafayette Park and 8th Street was irrespective of any decision from the White House or the President to visit the park, to visit the church. It was completely irrespective of that.
That's what I thought your position was. It was a complete coincidence, according to your testimony.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I also wanted to talk about the timing a little bit. What time was the curfew for, 7 p.m.?
Yes, sir. It was a 7 p.m. curfew.
Okay. And what did the curfew call for, Chief?
No members of the public could be out after 7 p.m.
Okay. And how was that communicated to the public?
I believe it was an order from the mayor's office in D.C.
Okay. And was that communicated clearly and cogently so that people in the public understood what that curfew was calling for?
So I was aware of the curfew in my role as the acting chief of the U.S. Park Police. I can't speak to what every member of the public understood it or were aware of.
Well, did the park police help to reinforce that 7 p.m. curfew that people had to disperse by 7 p.m.?
No, we did not play a role in enforcing the 7 p.m. curfew.
Okay.
You mentioned another injury on June 1st, and that, obviously that was regrettable. A facial laceration when an officer was punched in the face. You said that was in the clearing of H Street, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, H Street, of course, forms the northern boundary of Lafayette Park. Am I correct in that?
It does, yes.
Okay, so when did that happen? What time of day on June 1st, if you recall?
I don't know the exact time, but it was between 6:30 PM and 6:50 PM, which was the time for the clearing of H Street.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that that injury occurred after this so-called surge to disperse the crowd in Lafayette Park?
It was during the, as you described it, the surge to clear H Street.
Okay, so that injury did not happen before the surge, it happened during the surge.
It did. Throughout the operational period, our officers were subjected to a number of projectiles. They did not sustain any injuries. The only injury we sustained on June 1st was that instance.
Thank you, Chief, for answering my questions, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cartwright, Mr. Gatt is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Monahan, you said in your written testimony that the police have dealt with, your agency has dealt with hundreds of First Amendment demonstrations at special events. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Every year we facilitate
And thank
hundreds
you.
of
Thank you, sir. I only have 5 minutes. Now, you also testified that there were violent protests between May 29th and June 1st. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, you just told Mr. Cartwright that on June 1st, the one injury to the officer occurred during the clearing of H Street. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask you for unanimous consent to enter into the record the U.S. Park Police's use of force policy, General Order 3615, updated November 1, 2019. Thank you. I discussed this policy at the previous hearing, and Mr. Monahan, are you familiar with this policy?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
And the policy governs the conditions under which the Park Police's use of force is appropriate. So I'm going to ask you about some of those parts of the policy. One section of the policy says, quote, an officer is expected to employ only the minimum level of reasonable force necessary to control a situation. We've heard testimony and seen video evidence of the use of chemical irritants and of officers chasing protesters to beat them with batons. Mr. Monahan, do you believe that represented only the minimum level of reasonable force necessary to control the situation of Lafayette Square on June 1st?
Yes, in terms of the rules of engagement on June 1st, again, I will.
You believe you complied with the rules that those tactics were the minimum level of reasonable force given to control that situation. Is that right?
Yes, we stressed that the only force.
Okay.
We would
Thank
only
you.
utilize
Now-
force if we were met with violent resistance.
Okay, another section says, quote, once a level of force is no longer required, it must be decreased or discontinued. Now, did you conclude at any point on the evening of June 1st, after the push into the protesters began, that the level of force being used was no longer required to clear the square?
Yes, I think if you watch.
And what time was that? What time was that you decided that the level of force was no longer required?
So I'm not sure I understand your question, ma'am.
Okay, at some point after the push began, did you conclude that the level of force was being used was no longer required to clear the square? That's what your rules require.
Yeah, and I guess it requires a little bit of explanation. So it's a very fluid situation when we're clearing H Street. So throughout that operation, there was an instance where an officer was wrestled to the ground by an angry protester and a violent protester. He attempted to pull his handgun.
Excuse me, sir. You are not answering my question. Did you at any time during the clearing of the square determine that a de-escalation was appropriate? Yes or no?
Yeah, and I'm trying to give you a good example of.
You're not. You're just, okay, I'm going to move on. You're not going to answer my question. Finally, the policy says The goal of de-escalation tactics is to gain the voluntary compliance of a subject when appropriate and consistent with personal safety to reduce or eliminate the use of force. Now, I want to ask you, do you believe the Park Police's sudden surge into the entire protest crowd on June 1st was a genuine effort to get the protesters to voluntarily comply, and most importantly, to reduce or eliminate the necessity to use force?
Yes, I do.
Okay, now I want to ask you one more question since you've shown familiarity with these policies. Is there a section in the policies that allow the police to use force based on events of previous days' demonstrations? And I ask you this question because you have testified throughout this hearing today that in the previous days before June 1st, there were a number of officers injured and that there was a lot of violence used. But on June 1st, and so you're using that as your rationale for using violence from the beginning on June 1st, based on what happened in days before. Can you point me to a section of the policy that allows preemptive use of force based on previous demonstrations?
Ma'am, my testimony to you today is that the use of force that we utilized on June 1st was in direct correlation to the level of violence that we were subjected to on June 1st. Any reference to anything that occurred on May 29th, 30th, or 31st was for context.
Okay, so you're saying that what we're seeing the Park Police did on June 1st, the surge into the crowd, you're saying it's your position that that was directly related to the force that was being used by the protesters on that day immediately before the surge? Is that your
Mr. Chairman,
testimony, sir?
there's a pattern going
Time
on
is up.
here.
I'm trying to, sir. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Time is up. Let me
Okay, thank you,
recognize-
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Brown for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chief Monahan, thank you for testifying today. Let me just start by saying I do appreciate the responsibility that you and your officers have to maintain public safety. And I do understand the level of force and engagement that you need to take when you're dealing with unlawfulness, whether it's arson, looting, or other violence. But I think many on this committee are also concerned about how we engage peaceful protesters. And there seems to be a blurring of the lines between peaceful protesters and unlawfulness that perhaps you and your officers did not recognize. Let me ask you this question. The Washington Post reported that at 6:10 p.m. on June 1st, Attorney General Barr could be seen in CNN's live shot of the area at Lafayette Park. And at one point, Barr was speaking to a man who looked like a park police official. The official could be seen dropping his head in what looked like exaggerated resignation. One of the men with Barr even patted him on the back as though consoling him. And I'm going to ask the committee to show that video. And as they do, I want you to pull up, after they pull up the video, I want you to focus on the man, Chief Monahan, who approaches Attorney General Barr and appears to be a law enforcement official. Can we show that video, please?
Him with his security and his aides standing right there behind the police lines at Lafayette Park. I wonder if he's going to walk back to the White House and see and be there when the president makes his statement. That's going to be in a few moments. But right now, he's very close to where the action is at Lafayette Park, right across the street from the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. A very, very sensitive moment unfolding right now. I have no idea why Bill Barr decided to go there. He clearly may have just wanted to see the demonstrators, see the police on the scene, get a firsthand account. Looks like he's walking back now away from the police lines.
Chief Monahan, can you identify that law enforcement official in the video?
Captain Russell Fennell.
And was that captain the incident commander?
No, he was not.
No. Have you spoken with the captain who spoke with Attorney General Barr since June 1st?
Yes, I have.
And was that part of a sort of a after action review or a sort of to learn about events on that day?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Can you say the captain's name again, please?
His first name is Russell. His last name is Fennelly.
Fennelly. Did Captain Fennelly receive any instructions from Attorney General Barr?
No, he did not. If you look at the video, he proactively walks over to the group. You can see him with his hand.
What was the nature of the conversation that he had with Attorney General Barr? What did our Attorney General Barr ask him to do, or what information did Attorney General Barr give him?
Yes, sir. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. You can see him gesture to the left, to his left, and to his right. His point in addressing the group was that they were very close to the north end of Lafayette Park. They were very close to an area where we saw and had our officers subjected to projectiles being thrown at them earlier in the day on June 1st. And based on Captain Fennelly's assessment, they were way too close to the line and in a position of danger. He went
Do you have any idea why Captain Fennelly dropped his head and in response, a member of Attorney General Barr's detail patted him on the back?
Yes, I do. His purpose in addressing them was to ask them to move away from the area so they were in a safer location. And at the end of that exchange with the Attorney General's protective detail, they moved south through the park, away from the demonstration area.
And what information did Attorney General Barr convey to the captain?
I think it was the opposite, sir, to be honest with you. It was Captain Fennelly conveying to the Attorney
Captain
General
Monahan,
detail.
Chief Monahan, your officer responded to something that Attorney General Barr said. What did Attorney General Barr say to your officer on the ground?
And again, sir, it was our captain addressing the Attorney General and the group and his detail and requesting that they move away from the area towards a position of safety as opposed to being up there on the line. It was not safe.
And what was Barr's response? What was Attorney General Barr's response?
I think you can see their response on the video. They all moved south through the park. They heeded his warning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chairman yields. Let me turn to Ms. Dingle. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bishop, for convening this hearing to answer some of the unanswered questions from last month's hearing on the June 1st Lafayette Square protest. As my fellow committee members have stated, this sort of action on armed protesters being forcibly attacked by armed police without provocation both violates our fundamental principles and calls for us to closely examine how the events in question could have occurred. And I'm very grateful we have an administration witness here so that we can try to get some answers to some of these questions. Mr. Monahan, I think you would agree that managing large crowds like protests is a law enforcement challenge that requires specific knowledge and skills. If officers on duty are not properly trained, what are the potential consequences for protesters or the officers themselves?
So, ma'am, the United States Park Police officers are properly trained, and our focus that day was centered around the protection of life, protection of those that were there to peacefully assemble, to maintain law and order, and to ensure the safety of our officers. That is our focus for that demonstration on June 1st and any demonstration that we facilitate.
And am I correct, though? And you just said that all of your officers were trained. If you don't have trained officers, is it not the case that situations can quickly escalate and become violent?
No, I mean, we want to make sure that everybody is protected, not just those people who happen to be looking at.
Based on the scenario that you just mentioned, ma'am, yes, I would agree.
So in cases where there are singular incidents of violence, would the training advise attacking the entire crowd, or would it advise them to isolate and remove the individuals perpetrating that violence? And I'll give you an example. I have done 20 peaceful marches, walks, protests at home. And in a number of them, people have shown up with bricks and other things. Yet there's not been one episode of violence, because is it not true that you should try to isolate and remove those that are trying to perpetrate the problem?
Yes, and
I'm not asking
again,
you
our
trick
rules of
questions.
engagement that day were focused on, we would not use force unless we were met with violent resistance from the crowd. And those bad actors in the crowd subjected violent behavior against law enforcement throughout the operational period on June 1st.
So let me ask you about the other law enforcement units that were there in Lafayette Square that day. Do you know if there were any officers from any other agency present that were not trained in civil disturbance?
So the agencies that we partnered with that day that were involved in the clearing operation on H Street were all trained in civil disturbance.
So every officer, to your knowledge, that was present was trained that day?
Yes, ma'am, to my knowledge, yes.
So you commanded the police force at the tip of the spear that day. The Arlington County Police Department and the DC National Guard were there specifically to help the Park Police. So your presence was central. And you do know that everybody there was trained to deal with high pressure, high visibility, high consequence historic events.
Yes, ma'am. The United States Park Police, Secret Service Uniform Division, who are operating under unified command, and the partner agencies that assisted with that operation are all trained in civil disturbance. And our duty in an event like that, where we have sustained violence, being directed at law enforcement, is to protect the safety of the officers and for those that are there to peacefully demonstrate.
So let me ask you a question. How do you know that everybody there, I think it's very important, and having been places where people have tried to cause trouble, and how do you know it's true? How do you know that everybody you're working with has been trained in peaceful in dealing with these kinds of situations?
So the agencies, again, that were part of the clearing operation on H Street, the partner agencies that we dealt with, participate in the same training that we do.
And you make sure of that ahead of time?
Yes, ma'am. In terms of, these are regional partners that we collaborate with on a yearly basis for hundreds of demonstrations, larger demonstrations such as the one that we saw on June 1st, larger demonstrations such as the inauguration, things like that.
Thank you, Mr. Monahan.
Gentlelady yields back, and let me recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, would you mind going to a majority witness and then coming back, please? Excuse me, a majority member.
Let me recognize Mr. Soto, 5 minutes. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Chief Monahan, I'm sure you understand we're not here because you all erected a fence. And no one here is disputing the need for an appropriate response to the protests when they got violent on May 29th. And to the extent that your officers were injured, we're all very sorry about that. You're here because it appears that the President of the United States cleared peaceful protesters to have a photo op, to create a false appearance that he had protests under control, and to intimidate Americans from exercising their First Amendment rights. And as a result, there were numerous protesters who were there peacefully and were grievously injured as a result of the clearing. Do you think it's appropriate to forcefully clear protesters to pave the way for a photo op for President Trump?
No, sir, and that is not That was not our objective on June 1st. That was not what we accomplished on June 1st. Our focus on June 1st was centered around the safety of the demonstrators, to maintain law and order, and to ensure the safety of our officers, and we accomplished that goal.
What are the usual reasons you are ordered to remove Americans from Lafayette Square in other instances in your career?
So in this particular instance,
I'm asking about in the past.
so there are, from a historical basis, there are oftentimes throughout the course of a year, there are demonstrations on the south side of the White House sidewalk. And at times, based on what the group is and what they're there for, there are arrests that are made. It's more of an organized affair, if you will, but it's markedly different from what we saw on June 1st. What we saw on June 1st was a need to clear that area to create a safe space for the fencing company to install the fence. The whole concept of installing that fence was based on an effort to de-escalate the violence that was rising from May 29th through June 1st and throughout the operational period on June 1st. That was our goal. Those were the objectives on June 1st.
Acting Chief Monahan, if you're given an illegal order by a superior, you have a duty to refuse that order. Is that correct?
Can you repeat the question? You said if I was given an illegal order?
Yes. If you've been given an illegal order by a superior, you have a duty to refuse that order. Is that correct?
That's accurate, yes.
So if you were giving an order to clear Lafayette Square for campaign purposes for the President of the United States, would that be an illegal order?
That's not my testimony today, sir. Our operation and our objective on June 1st was to clear that area, to establish the anti-scale fencing in an effort to de-escalate the violence that was on the rise since May 29th.
I understand.
To provide for the safety of the protesters, to maintain law and order, and to provide for the safety of our officers.
I understand what your intent and interpretation was, Acting Chief Monahan. I'm asking more in theory, since many of us have disagreements on what happened that day. Would it be illegal for you all to clear Lafayette Square for campaign purposes for a President of the United States?
And sir, respectfully, I'm not here to engage in theoretical conversations about what transpired on June 1st. I'm here to give you an accurate accounting of what happened. And on June 1st, as I described, our focus was to clear Lafayette Park, install that anti-scale fencing for the safety of those that were there to peacefully assemble, to maintain law and order, and to provide for the safety of our officers.
Thank you, Chief. I agree we need to maintain law and order, which is why it's important to refuse illegal orders, particularly when they're wholly of a political nature. And with that, I yield back.
There we go. The chair now recognizes Mr. Grace for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start out by saying, number one, I believe that there are racial injustices and inequities that we absolutely need to address as a United States Congress. And I do believe in some cases those are systemic. I also want to commend on the next panel, Major DeMarco, for him stepping up and expressing concern about what he viewed as something that was inappropriate. And lastly, in this regard, I want to say that some of the reports of folks being detained and questioned without any charges, not by you, but by some of the protesters out west and law enforcement out west. I do support the investigation of those, and I want to be clear that I don't believe that this provides that protests provide an opportunity to infringe on people's constitutional rights. That being said, Chief, I believe I heard you earlier. I've been hearing bits and pieces of this hearing. I believe I heard you earlier say that Park Police have participated in hundreds of demonstrations across the Washington area and other areas. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, on an annual basis.
Okay, and so probably fair to say that you and your officers are more practiced
in dealing with protesters than most police forces around the United States.
Yes, sir, I would like to think so, yes.
And probably get more training in that regard as well.
I can only speak to the level of training that we get, but,
Okay.
yes.
So next question is, of the hundreds of protests that you and your officers have participated in, how many of those have included the violence that your officers saw in the preceding days to what we're discussing today? Meaning the injury of officers, the fires, the damage to public property and things along those lines.
They happen from time to time. In my experience, they're the exception, not the rule.
And so is it fair to say, and don't let me put words in your mouth, that this was really an extraordinary protest in regard to the damage, in regard to the intensity, in regard to the injury to your officers? I believe I read somewhere over 50 officers were injured.
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. So Mr. Chairman, I think that we first of all need to be very clear that there's nothing normal about this. This was an absolutely extraordinary effort, and you had folks that were extraordinarily experienced and trained to deal with this. Mr. Chairman, I believe it was last week, we'd had or week before we had the Great Outdoors Act or whatever under the jurisdiction of this committee, though the bill didn't actually come through the committee, where we appropriated mandatory spending billions of dollars to maintain fences and signs and toilets and other things at our national parks and other federal lands that comprise 28% of the United States of America. We did this as mandatory spending, billions of dollars. It goes on in perpetuity, no end. 200 years from now, we're still spending it under the law that was passed. This is the second hearing that we're having on an incident that happened at Lafayette Park, 1 square block across the street from the White House. Mr. Chairman, there's a global pandemic right now. We have record unemployment. We have a record recession right now. We're seeing the virus take off everywhere, and we're wasting time on this. And I'll say it again. I absolutely believe that we need to protect the constitutional rights of our citizens, but this is ridiculous, and the way the chief is being treated is absolutely ridiculous. Think about it for just a minute. Your line of questioning is that the president was trying to advance a campaign initiative. Yet what you're doing is you're trying to advance a campaign initiative using official resources right here. The hypocrisy is absolutely disgusting watching what's happening here. Chief, everybody's showing clips that promote their narrative. There were fires. There were dozens of your officers that were being injured as a result of this protest. I think it's absolutely disgusting that folks are trying to spin this narrative. Now, I understand the next panel, Major DeMarco is going to be talking about what his perspective. As I understand, there was a meeting on Saturday that determined the need for a fence. Was the major involved in those meetings that talked about the justification for erecting the fence in the meeting with the park police?
No, sir, he was not.
Okay, so again, I commend him for sharing what he viewed as being inappropriate, but I also think it's important to note that perhaps he was not aware of all of the information that was out there. Chief, I have a lot of other questions, but there's 20 seconds left. Very quickly, are there any other things that you would like to share with the committee or the public? I know you were cut off repeatedly in your questions, so I'll give you the last few seconds here.
Yeah, again, I would just go back to my original point that our objective on June 1st was to provide for public safety. Our objective on June 1st was to maintain law and order, to ensure that any lawful demonstration could continue uninterrupted, and to provide for the safety of our officers, and I think we accomplished that goal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask, just for the record, if the chief could please provide the committee with information indicating whether those protesters that were closer to the LRAD system that were announcing the distribution of protesters, if they seem to leave more so or disproportionately to those that were further away, meaning if folks were actually responding to the announcements or not. Yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And yes, there is a severe and cruel pandemic going on, and your lecture notwithstanding, that lecture would be very appropriate with your president, so he can understand there is a cruel and vast pandemic going on in this country. With that, let me recognize Mr. Sablan.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for holding this hearing to actually learn why federal law enforcement may have violated the First Amendment rights of the peaceful demonstrators at Lafayette Park, and for some even thinking that this was done so the president would have get a chance to go and stand in front of a church and hold a Bible, and actually never went into kneel and say a prayer. But I yield my time at this time to Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Sablan. I have a couple questions. Who were the other police officers and departments that were there besides National Park Service?
The agencies that assisted us in the clearing of 8th Street, Park Police, U.S. Secret Service, Arlington County Police Department. And that's it. We had Federal Protective Service was inside the inside the park.
I want to run something, a couple of timelines for you so I could get them straight. At 6:10, that meeting happened with whatever captain that was and Barr. At what time does the incident commander give the order to start pushing on the protesters?
So the first warning that was given to the protesters that the area was being closed so that we can install the fence was given at 6:23 p.m.
6:23 p.m. And then they started moving on the protesters at what time?
Our operation began right around 6:30 p.m.
Yeah, I have 6:35. I'll give you the 5 minutes. At 6:43, as you guys are pushing, I want to read you exactly what the president is saying at 6:43. I am also taking swift and decisive action to protect our great capital, Washington, D.C. What happened in the city last night was a total disgrace. As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and wanton destruction of property. In his remarks, the president is bragging about ordering law enforcement to take on protesters in D.C. Yet you are arguing that the Park Police solely made this decision about when to push based on the best scenario and situation for putting up the fencing. Is that correct?
No, sir, I'm not arguing with you. I'm telling you factually what happened, and that was our
certainly isn't factual. So at 6:43, this is happening, and then also coincidentally, there is no radio recording of that day. So there is this timeline that kind of all makes sense if you put it together. I mean, if I was prosecuting somebody, I'd probably have them dead to rights right now. 6:10 a.m. first meeting, 6:30, 6:23 first warning order, 6:35 push on the protesters, 6:43. President gives his rah-rah speech, no radio comms, we can't find anything, and then you claim that you were meeting violent resistance. But yet, there is no violent resistance. You claim, and I think you're accurate about this, that the only violent resistance that was met that day was after the initial push. There was no officer that was injured prior to your order. Is that correct?
So I would not equate violent resistance with injured force members. We were subjected to projectiles throughout the day on June 1st. We were met with violent resistance on the clearing operation of the north end of Lafayette.
Of course you're going to meet with violent resistance. You threw pepper balls and you were taunting people.
And again, our rules of engagement, sir, were to only use force if we were met with violent resistance.
So you claim there was violent resistance prior to the clearing of the clearing that started at 6:35.
Yes, and I believe I gave you numerous examples. There were individuals that jumped over the police line several times that day. There were projectiles being thrown at officers throughout the day.
So this is all one big coincidence. At that point, this is when the violent resistance had finally swelled, that you had to do it at this exact point, which happens to be probably 7 minutes before the president starts his speech. It just happened. You couldn't wait till 7 p.m. to do it when there's probably people actually starting to retreat because of the curfew. At the exact same moment, which we have no radio comms whatsoever, coincidentally, that one day, that all happened in that span of 30 minutes, and it all happened exactly how you're reporting it.
And we have a written record of radio comms that day, but our decision to clear 8th Street at the time that we did was based on an on-the-ground assessment of the violence that was subjected at law enforcement that day. That is a fact, yes.
Your assessment was totally off. Last question. Did the U.S. Park Police coordinate with anybody in the White House or the Secret Service?
So as I stated earlier, we were operating under unified command with the United States Secret Service.
So in that day, did you have communication with the White House or Secret Service at that time?
Communication with the Secret Service, I wouldn't say it was with the White House. I would think they were two separate things.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chairman, question of the chair.
Mr. Costa?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Was it the order of the mayor of DC to have no public at 7 o'clock? Is that the order that I keep hearing about?
That was part of the testimony, that there was an order by the.
Yeah, so it would make sense that you would start clearing earlier so that they could achieve that goal of the mayor.
Convenient, but no cigar. But,
I think very much cigar.
let me ask, Mr. Cunningham, let me recognize, Mr. Cunningham for his 5 minutes, sir, you're recognized. I think he's gone. Mr. Clay, if he's still online? He's not part of the committee. I didn't recognize the opportunity.
He yielded his 5 minutes to me, didn't he?
Yeah. And if there's no objection, there's no objection to unanimous consent that Mr. Byer be allowed to join the committee and ask questions. Hearing none, Mr. Byer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for waving me on. And I certainly want to object to Mr. Graves' notion that we're sponsoring a narrative. Yeah, this is right across the river from my district. My goodness.
Yeah.
I hope this is coming in. It has been fine all day. Mr. Chairman, I hope this computer is working well, but it doesn't seem to be.
You see, what's going on? Yeah. Mr. Byer?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, apparently the video traffic in Alexandria has crushed this. So if I can go on with an audio, if that would be permissible. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. There's no objections. Mr. Byer?
Okay, thank you. So Acting Chief Monahan, I had and continue to have 3 key behavioral worries over the incident that day. First and foremost, for my constituents, this is right across the river from my district, as you know. Many of my constituents were in the crowd and in physical danger, including my daughter and her fiance. I talked to many, many people who were there who described a completely different picture than what you did. And I remain very worried about how police engagement has endangered many lawful and peaceful protesters. The second big worry is what happened to the Arlington County Police, who are also my constituents, and our local police force, who were weaponized under your authority that day. They were the front lines. The push of protesters was wholly inappropriate, and not the understanding that the county had for any sort of peaceful protest engagement that routinely happens in the nation's capital. That's why the chairman of the board pulled them back as soon as she heard about that. Their actions under the Park Police cost them local trust that they are actively working to rebuild. And I know that it was a cause of embarrassment and regret for them. And third, most importantly, the behavior of the Park Police officers, many of whom, again, I know are my constituents. But with the behavior that day, they lost our community's trust. And why is this important? Because in the National Capital Region, Park Police are an important local law enforcement entity, and we depend on them to do the right thing, and here they failed us. This was not the first problematic incident, nor should I say that Bijan Gaysar's death in November 2017 either, but Lafayette compounded my concerns. You talked about, you couldn't talk about the interaction with the press because there was an ongoing investigation. We're in the same position with Bijan Gaysar. I wrote you back in November 2019 to get an update on the Bijan Gaysar investigation. I got a letter back this month, 8 months later, saying that you couldn't comment because there was an ongoing investigation over a murder that happened almost 3 years ago. In the months after Bijan's murder, I met with then Chief McLean, who committed to me that the Park Police would adopt body cameras. I thought that was smart and an excellent commitment to future accountability and transparency. In fact, the only reason we know about Bijan Gaysar was because the Fairfax County Police had their dash cameras on. And now it's 2020. We have this weird deal where the comms didn't work for the Park Police that day, no record. And Lafayette was another flagrant red flag for Park Police behavior. And again, because there were no body cameras, much of what we know happened was because of other law enforcement communications. I've been following up with your department for years now and asking for body cameras to be adopted since they were committed to me. But the Park Police has not, nor have I been provided with any rationale for a lack of adoption. And ironically, largely every other law enforcement in the Department of Interior has adopted body cameras. There's language in the House Interior Appropriations Bill that we just passed last week that gets you the money and addresses any policy concerns you may have, thanks to Betty McCollum's leadership. So there's literally no excuse for the Park Police not to adopt body cameras. In fact, you'd be in a much better position today with your testimony if you had them. So, Chief, can you commit to me, to the National Resources Committee today, that you will adopt body cameras?
Yeah, thank you for the question, sir. So it's true, the United States Park Police does not currently have a body-worn camera program. We are supportive of such a program. We acknowledge its alignment with contemporary trends in law enforcement, as well as the expectations from the public. However, at this time, we are not in a position to successfully implement, manage, and sustain a body-worn camera program.
Mr. Chairman, let me just ask that the money and the policy is in the appropriations bill. So I hope that will not be your ongoing answer. And with that, I yield back.
First of all, Mr. Monahan, thank you for appearing today. We do more questions to follow. I think in all the discussion, we've heard many things, and why the June 1st incident at Lafayette is so important, because everything else that is going around the issue, not only of questions of police reform, abuse, the calls by this administration and the president specifically of sending more and more federal presence into communities, whether they want them or not. I think the precursor to much of this discussion began June 1st with the president's presence there and the premature clearing of the park. And just out of my own curiosity, when did you, Chief, know that the president was coming to St. John's? And how did you learn about it?
Yes, sir. So we were notified earlier in the day that the president was going to visit Lafayette Park to view the damage that was done to the park over the course of the preceding days. But we were not given a time on when he was visiting.
And on the scene on that day, who had the tactical command on the scene? In particular, who ordered the officers to move forward on the first surge at 6:30? Who said now, go, or gave the command of the clearing? Did the order go through you to move forward at that time?
Yes, so the order was given by the incident commander from the United States Park Police. And on June 1st, the incident commander was Major Mark Adamczyk.
And go over for me the chain of command. I'm following up on Mr. Gallegos and some other people's questions. The chain of command you were going through, all the way from the president down in terms of your role in commanding the U.S. Park Police, as you do, literally leading the charge, and the two other agencies, Arlington County, and that was supporting the Park Police, and D.C. National Guard. So what's the chain of command in that process?
Yeah, so the chain of command for an incident such as the one on June 1st, we're operating under an ICS model, or an incident command system model. The incident commander for the United States Park Police, again, was Major Mark Adamczyk. We were operating under unified command, so he had a counterpart on the Secret Service side.
And who was above the incident commander from the Park Police?
So he has full command and control of that operation,
okay.
And he has the authority to make any and all decisions for that operation.
And the order was given verbally in person over the well, not over the radio, or using some other means?
Which order are you referring to, sir?
The order to move, to remove the crowd at 6:30.
Yeah, so in terms of the warnings that were given to the public, they were given via the use of a long-range acoustic device that we described earlier. He gave the first of 3 warnings beginning at 6:23 p.m. Prior to giving those warnings, he gave a briefing to all of the commanders that were going to be involved in the clearing of H Street so that they understood what the operation was and what the rules of engagement were.
And who authorized Park Police to use weapons, munitions, and devices that were used, in particular the chemical irritants? Did any of the lawyers that were supposed to review the actions say that it was okay? Who would that be to authorize that?
Yeah, so the authorization on the rules of engagement lies with the incident commander. I concurred with the change in our rules of engagement for June 1st, which expressly prohibited the use of CS gas.
And much has been said, and for the people under your command, the officers that were hurt, we're glad that they have made a recovery and they're doing well. But I think one of the issues here today too is that, as like I said, it's a precursor to much of the discussions going on about law and order and how politicized it's become. What part of the questions we have is wonder whether our government even understands the difference between an unruly, violent mob and people peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. And even worse, Chief, is the fact that we're seeing the administration continue to expand this authoritarian approach to law enforcement with the issues in Portland and in other major cities. And like I said, June 1st stands out as a date, and we will continue to pursue. And with that, I don't have any other questions. Chief, appreciate your time and your cooperation.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent for?
Absolutely.
Okay. Unanimous consent to add to the record a fact sheet from DOI regarding June 1st, the events.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered. Now we're good. There's no other questions. Thank you, Mr. Chief Monahan, and we'll invite our next witness forward. Where's the introduction to Monahan? I have it over here somewhere. What is it, Major? Major. Now we'll begin our second panel. If Major DeMarco would join us, thank you. Adam DeMarco is a strategy and operations consultant for a consulting firm here in DC. He's also a major in the District of Columbia Army National Guard, where he has served and completed his active duty with the U.S. Army in 2014. He is testifying pursuant to the Military Whistleblower Protection Act. I want to take a brief moment to recognize his father, Mr. Frank DeMarco. Thank you for joining us, sir, who has traveled a long way to be here in the room with his son. And as a reminder, under committee rules, Mr. Marco, your oral statement is 5 minutes. Your entire statement is part of the record. And again, thank you very much. And you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I come before the committee to help ensure that there's a fair, factual record of what happened at Lafayette Square based on what I saw and experienced firsthand. I especially want this committee, the residents of Washington, D.C., and the American people to know that the D.C. National Guard performed with the utmost professionalism and integrity, faithful to our Constitution under the most challenging of circumstances. On June 1st, I served as a liaison between the District of Columbia National Guard and the Park Police at Lafayette Square. The role of the National Guard was to support the Park Police operation to clear demonstrators from the vicinity of Lafayette Square. The immediate objective of this clearing operation, as the Park Police informed me, was to install a larger security barricade on H Street along the northern edge of Lafayette Square. The DC National Guard was not to be actively engaged in the clearing operation. Rather, we would follow behind Park Police units and help to secure an expanded security perimeter once established by the Park Police. National Guardsmen were outfitted with standard riot gear such as face masks, shields, shin guards, and batons for defensive purposes. But no National Guardsmen were armed with lethal or non-lethal munitions that evening. From what I observed, the demonstrators were behaving peacefully, exercising their First Amendment rights. At around 6:20 p.m., the Park Police issued the first of 3 warning announcements to the demonstrators, directing them to disperse. I did not expect the announcement so early, as the DC curfew was not to go into effect until 7 p.m. that evening, 40 minutes later. The warnings were conveyed using a megaphone near the statue of President Andrew Jackson, approximately 50 yards from the demonstrators. From where I was standing, approximately 20 yards from the demonstrators, the announcements were barely audible, and I saw no indication that the demonstrators were cognizant of the warnings to disperse. At approximately 6:30 p.m., the Park Police began the clearing operation, led by the civil disturbance units and horse-mounted officers. No National Guard personnel participated in the push or engaged in any other use of force against the demonstrators. As the clearing operation began, I heard explosions and saw smoke used to disperse the protesters. The Park Police liaison officer told me that the explosions were stage smoke and that no tear gas was being deployed against the demonstrators. But I could feel irritation in my eyes and nose, and based off my previous exposure to tear gas and training, I recognized that irritation as effects consistent with CS or tear gas. And later that evening, I found spent tear gas canisters on the street nearby. As Park Police pushed the demonstrators further down H Street, I saw demonstrators scattering and fleeing as Park Police charged towards them. I observed people fall to the ground, and some Park Police used their shields offensively as weapons. As I walked behind Park Police pushing westward on H Street, I also observed unidentified law enforcement personnel behind our National Guardsmen using paintball-like weapons to discharge what I later learned to be pepper balls into the crowd as demonstrators continued to flee. After H Street had been cleared, I took up a position on 16th Street near St. John's Church. At around 7:05 p.m., I saw the president walking onto H Street from Lafayette Square near St. John's Church. The president's arrival was a complete surprise, as we had not been briefed that he would enter our sector. As for the new security barrier, whose installation was a stated purpose for the clearing operation, the materials to erect it did not arrive on scene on H Street until around 9 p.m. that evening, and it was not completed until later on. Members of the committee, the events I witnessed at Lafayette Square on the evening of June 1st were deeply disturbing to me and fellow National Guardsmen. Based on my training and experience, at no time did I feel threatened by the protesters or assess them to be violent. And based on established U.S. military protocols concerning proportionality of force in dealing with civil disturbances, both within the United States and overseas, it was my observation that the use of force against demonstrators in the clearing operation was an unnecessary escalation of the use of force. From my observation, those demonstrators, our fellow American citizens, were engaged in the peaceful expression of their First Amendment rights. Yet they were subjected to an unprovoked escalation and excessive use of force. As the late Representative John Lewis said, when you see something that is not right, not just, not fair, you have a moral obligation to say something. to do something. The oath I swore as a military officer to support and defend the United States Constitution is a bedrock guiding principle for me. It's the foundation of the trust safely placed in the armed forces by the American people. And it compels me to say something, to do something about what I witnessed on June 1st at Lafayette Square. I thank you for your time and this opportunity and look forward to your questions.
Let me recognize, we'll begin the same way as the last time. Mr. Huffman, recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Major DeMarco, you're not part of the Park Police Force, so you may not be as familiar with the 2015 legal settlement that I discussed with the acting chief. But you did hear, I think, the elements of that settlement, the specific requirements of how, when confronting protesters, the Park Service police are required to stage in a very specific way with officers in the back of the crowd who would visually and verbally confirm that warnings were loud enough to be heard and understood, that those warnings needed to include a very clear reference to specific legal violations and a warning that arrests would ensue. And so you were on the ground. You've testified that you were just a few yards from the front line here. Tell me, if you can, if you believe that Chief Monahan's version of this, that every one of those elements was complied with to the letter. Was that your experience as a firsthand witness?
Sir, on the ground, I am not aware of a long-range acoustic device being in position or utilized for the proclamation to disperse.
You talked about a megaphone, a standard megaphone. And now maybe that's what they mean when they say long-range acoustic device, but the only thing you heard was a standard megaphone, correct?
That is correct. A megaphone placed on a bench utilized through a handheld microphone.
All right. And do you believe that it was audible enough to be understood by the protesters throughout the crowd?
Negative, sir. I could barely understand the message that was being delivered.
Did you see anything to suggest that there were officers in the back of the crowd that were somehow confirming that it was loud enough to be understood?
I did not observe that, sir.
What about the behavior of the protesters? Did anything in their reaction or behavior suggest to you that they had either understood or not understood what had been said in that megaphone?
I saw no change in their disposition or posture.
All right. And did you hear in the warning, did you hear any reference to a specific law that was being violated?
I could just make out every other word in the statement that was being delivered.
All right. I want to ask about the fencing that's been offered as a justification for why this all had to happen. And the acting chief said that the fencing, contrary to your testimony, had arrived several hours earlier, but I think he had said it was staged a couple blocks away. Is there any reason why, if it was important to install that fencing as soon as it was on site, that it wouldn't have happened a couple hours earlier if that fencing had already arrived by that point?
Sir, I can't get into hypotheticals as to why why it was not installed at that time. Based off of the Army training publications and the various doctrine that we use in installing and maintaining defensive static positions, certainly I would have looked at other time frames to install that fence.
But you found it odd that you had a 7 p.m. curfew coming up just 25 minutes later, and the fencing could have been installed at that point in a manner that avoided a confrontation, potentially. Am I understanding your suggestion correctly?
At the time, I didn't make that correlation. I was just there focused on getting the mission and getting our soldiers safely off the LMTVs that they arrived on and into position to support the park.
So about the mission, were you told that this was about fencing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me just ask, if I could, about the timing of the clearing of the crowd. There's some live tweeting from CNN, a CNN reporter that suggests from that moment that the advance began, I believe it was 6:35, within 10 minutes, this crowd of several thousand people, by all accounts, was gone. That suggests to me that there was great urgency, that there was a very rapid clearing of the crowd. What was your observation?
Based off of Army Trading Publication 3-39.33 entitled Civil Disturbance, that escalation to rapidly move and disperse people is not in accordance with what I understood as to be the suggested and guided practice to clear the sector.
So the urgency, the speed of that clearing was unusual in your experience. Is that correct?
I was taken by surprise, correct.
Do you infer from that that was part of the objective by the Park Police, that clearing with speed was their intention?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Heiss, sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. DeMarco, excuse me, DeMarco, for being here. In the previous panel, Chief Monahan testified that the decision to install the fencing was actually made 2 days before June 1st. It was on Saturday, the 30th of May, and that, of course, was in the aftermath of the most violent protests that took place over the weekend. The Park Service and the U.S. Secret Service rightfully wanted to take steps to prevent that from happening. Were you a part of those discussions 2 days prior?
No, sir.
On the 1st of June, what kind of role did you have? Were you in a senior position of command and control, or were you there primarily as a supportive role?
I was not a commander, nor was I the officer in charge. I was simply the liaison between the Park Police and the DC National Guard. I would receive the missions and taskings and then alert the senior OIC, officer in charge on the ground, of what the Park Police was requesting.
So a supportive role
yes, sir.
In that regard. Okay. Thank you. You state that the fencing did not arrive until 9 p.m. on June 1st. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The folks on the ground with the Park Police and the Secret Service share a different timeline. Here's the timeline that they have. The fencing company site manager arrived at 3:30 p.m. on June 1st. The company's staff arrived shortly thereafter. The fencing material was delivered at 5 p.m. The order was given at 6:23. The square was cleared by 6:50, and trucks with material reportedly moved in the square immediately, and construction began at 7:30. So, I mean, there's not a matchup in your timeline and what actually took place. How do you reconcile this?
Yes, sir. From my position, which was on 8th Street and 16th Street, the first sighting I had of the 18-wheeler carrying the non-scalable fence was at 9 p.m. that evening, on or around, and the completion of that fence did not occur until about 10:30 p.m. later that evening.
So I guess from what you're saying, there's at least the possibility that from the location where you were not able to see all the activity and realize what was taking place elsewhere.
That's correct, sir. However, the fence was only being installed along 8th Street from Connecticut to Vermont.
Okay, but the timeline, it actually started at 7:30, so I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt that your location, you didn't perhaps see all that was taking place.
It's possible, sir.
You stated just a few moments ago about the 3 warnings. Your testimony here, I ran back and was looking at it. You said that at 6:20, the Park Police issued, and these are your words, Park Police issued first of 3 warning announcements to the demonstrators directing them to disperse. And so you just said you didn't hear that, but your testimony says they gave 3 warnings.
So they did, but I did not hear the full proclamation that was being given. But around that time at 6:20 p.m., the warnings began.
Okay, so how, if you didn't hear them, how were you aware that they took place?
Because I was approximately 30 yards away, and I saw the Park Police officer with the megaphone laying on a bench holding.
You were 30 yards away from where? I'm trying to picture this.
From essentially the President Jackson statue.
Okay, so you heard the announcement.
But I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, sir.
Okay, but enough to where you knew it was the first of 3 warnings to disperse.
Negative, sir. Unless
that's your testimony. That's your written testimony.
Correct. If I was standing up at the line, I would have no idea what they were actually saying. I was in a position of privilege where I could hear, and I expected something to be coming from them.
Okay. Again, your written testimony says at 6:20 is very precise. that they gave the first of 3 warnings. Anyway, we'll go on from there. Let me just ask in closing, Mr. DeMarco, I thank you for your service and a great deal of service that you've done, and even politically. Have you ever run for Congress?
Yes, sir.
And when did you do that?
2018.
In what party were you?
A Democrat.
Okay. I think it's very interesting that how a lot of these dots connect as we continue defaming the police department and attacking them for their stated purpose of protecting public safety and the rule of law and the safety of our law enforcement. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back for now.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Holland, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Major DeMarco. Major DeMarco, it seems that some law enforcement officers at Lafayette were not pleased about what they were asked to do on that day. Arlington County pulled their police officers from their role in assisting the U.S. Park Police because they were shocked about how their officers were used to attack peaceful protesters. It seemingly just wasn't what they had signed up for. We've heard about how members of the National Guard who were at Lafayette Square have struggled with the things they were asked to do on June 1st. Because it runs directly counter to the very reasons they decided to serve their country and to their oath to support and defend the Constitution. In your testimony today, you courageously expressed similar sentiments, that what you saw our government do was wrong, and that it was difficult to reconcile being put in that situation with your commitment to your country and your fellow Americans. Could you tell us a bit more about how this affected you personally as an officer in the National Guard?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for that question. In the days following June 1st, I struggled to process exactly what had happened and taken place. To the point where I was sleeping very little, and I started trying to figure out what the next steps were. I'd confided in several other officers within the District of Columbia National Guard, as well as other friends and advisors that I've served with, both on active duty and in support of active duty operations. A couple days later, I decided that I needed to memorialize my record or my memory, and I wrote my own sworn statement on my own volition. And I read it in front of another officer, and he signed off on it because I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. And then it was shortly thereafter that I started reaching out to seeing what could be done because I truly felt compelled that I had to say something. I started talking to other soldiers that are in my unit, soldiers that I have a supervisory authority over, and they were expressing many of the same consternations and concerns. So I knew that it wasn't just me who had witnessed this and felt that there was something both morally and legally wrong. And in trying to process that, I realized that, I am in a position as a major in the United States Army National Guard where I can do something. And that's why I decided to come forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Major. And I'm sorry you were put in that position. Are you aware of any other concerns from other people, your colleagues in the DC National Guard that were there that day? And have they shared with you how this incident has affected them?
Yes, ma'am. One of these soldiers in my unit, without giving out any personally identifiable information, is not a native-born American citizen from a developed country. And in talking to him and helping him trying to understand what he saw and his role in that, which he, acted honorably, he said that the events of June 1st were those that he expected to see in his home country, not here in the United States. And that was a very troubling statement that I heard from him, but I told him that, we were doing the right thing, and is another reason on a long litany of reasons why I'm here today to testify.
And along these same lines, what does being put in this kind of situation do for the morale and the mental health of the people you serve with?
The District of Columbia National Guard has been outstanding in ensuring that our soldiers and airmen have received the support from both chaplain and emotional support counselors to ensure that they understand and they have the resources available if they need any further counseling.
And Major DeMarco, as an officer, would you ever put your fellow guardsmen or women in a position where they were attacking citizens who were largely peacefully protesting?
Absolutely not, ma'am.
And you mentioned in your statement that Mark Milley reminded you that the DC Guard was there to respect the rights of protesters. Were you and your Guard members confused why you had been told you were there to protect the rights of Americans and then realized that you were asked to back up officers as they attacked these same protesters you were supposed to respect?
Negative, ma'am. When we arrived in support of the United States Park Police, we arrived to help them, but also to maintain to serve, under our oath to support and defend the Constitution. Just because we were in a supporting role did not change the way that we operate or the laws that we abide by.
Thank you for answering my questions. I yield, Chairman.
Recognize, sir.
Thank you. Major DeMarco, since you have said you brought up the First Amendment at least 3 times, maybe more, in your statement, that you said we were there to respect the demonstrators' First Amendment rights. Was that the order that was given? You guys in the National Guard, get out there, and your job is to respect the demonstrators' First Amendment rights. Who gave that order?
Negative, sir. That was a statement from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley.
Oh, yeah. That's the same chairman of the Joint Chiefs that went out and criticized the President of the United States. This is a different military than the one I served in, because when I was in the Army at Fort Benning, commanders constantly reminded us that, look, everybody knows that President Carter is doing terrible damage to the military, but if anyone criticizes their commander-in-chief anywhere but very privately, they'll either get an Article 15 or they'll be court-martialed. So this is a new military I'm finding where the chair of the Joint Chiefs feels it's perfectly okay to demean his commander-in-chief, and then you felt the need to come out and testify differently from what we have heard from people within the administration and others that were out there. So I'm trying to get used to this new military where you don't really feel an obligation to answer to the civilian elected commander-in-chief. This is really intriguing. Now, the rules of evidence and relevance here are much more relaxed than they are in a jury trial, but even in a jury trial, you'd be compelled to ask, did the Democratic Party give you any financial assistance when you ran against John Sarbanes for Congress?
No, sir. I was all self-financed.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how many publications have mentioned your name since you came out against the reports by people within the administration at Lafayette Park? Any idea?
Negative, sir. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb last night.
Yeah, okay. Well, apparently it's a whole lot more than you ever got when you got that 8.5% or so running for Congress. So it looks like this is going to serve you well with the Democratic Party. But I am still quite concerned about our military. So your job was to observe the First Amendment rights of the demonstrators. Were you out there when the St. John's was set on fire? There were 2 fires set in the church?
Sir, I was there that evening. By the time the church fire was reported, I was over by the Lincoln Memorial
Do you happen to know of your own personal knowledge who the peaceful, loving demonstrator was or demonstrators that set the church on fire?
I have no knowledge of who's demonstrating, sir.
There apparently were some injuries out there. Are you familiar with how many law enforcement officers have been hurt by peaceful, law-abiding, loving demonstrators?
I'm aware of the injuries that occurred between the periods of 29 May to 31 May, which is abhorrent. I'm also aware of the injuries of 6 National Guard personnel that were injured during that time frame.
Were they injured by Park Police?
Negative, sir. They were injured. One was concussed, I believe, from a projectile, and then others
But that was from one of the people that was just observing his First Amendment rights. Do you know what Supreme Court cases include in the First Amendment rights the right to concuss law enforcement?
Sir, I have no legal background, so I can't answer that.
All right, I'm just curious. Well, I really have no other questions for this, so I yield back.
So, Mr. Lowenthal, you recognized? Mr. Lowenthal?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Major DeMarco, let me just get the question. Major, first, thank you for testifying. And I'm concerned about what I had read about or learned a little bit about, and do you know anything about Army helicopters hovering low over Washington, D.C. relating to the event on June 1st?
Yes, sir.
Can you discuss these and how you know these claims, what is said to be true? Can you discuss what you know?
Yes, sir. After the clearing of H Street, I was informed by the United States Park Police that there will be low-flying military helicopters in our area of operations. Shortly thereafter, I observed the first UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter flying north of my position, which was at that point 16th and I Street. I observed the helicopter had no distinctive markings on it. However, the doors were open. When I made that observation, I then assumed that it was a public affairs helicopter going around taking photos of our response in support of the United States Park Police. Later that evening, as the wall or fence was being built along H Street, I then heard radio transmissions over the radio, the DC National Guard Internal Communications Network, that there was a low-flying helicopter in the vicinity of 15th Street and F Street, which is near Chinatown. The transmissions that I was receiving were that there was a low-flying helicopter and it was making the pepper spray of the DC Metro Police Department ineffective. I kept hearing this over the radio. I didn't know what was going on in that area of operations as it was out of our sector. I then called over to the DC Armory Joint Operations Center and spoke to an officer there and asked him if he had any information as to what was happening. I told him the report that I had heard. He then communicated with someone within the operations center, and I hung up the phone, and that was the last that I heard of it.
Was there another one? Was there any that had medical markings on them? And you mentioned earlier that you believe that the Park Police knew it in advance, or at least that some of these helicopter operations were going to occur. Can you explain that?
Yes, sir. To your first question, later reporting indicates that one of the helicopters flying in the vicinity of 15th Street and F Street had a medical Red Cross designation on it. To your second point, the first that I learned about Army aviation assets being used in this mission was from the United States Park Police.
Do helicopters fly when they fly this low? Is that an intimidation maneuver? The Metropolitan, I believe, Police Department complained that the roto wash made it hard for them to use pepper spray or pepper balls.
Sir, I'm not a pilot, and my aviation experience is very limited, so I can't speak to the tactics, techniques, and procedures of our aviation assets and pilots.
Does using helicopter in this way strike you as a sensible or safe way to do these operations?
Sir, I'm not in a position to talk about the safety or unsafe actions of pilots.
But you are aware that the Park Police knew in advance, at least that some of these helicopters were going to be there.
Based off of the timeline and the notification, yes, sir.
And how were these, again, can you just explain in my last time, how were these helicopters to be used? Or did you know that they were used?
I was not aware of their task and purpose within the area of operations.
Okay, thank you, and I'm going to yield back.
And yields, recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, sir.
Yes, Major DeMarco, you reached the conclusions that protesters were subject to an unprovoked escalation on June 1st. However, this is historically different characterization of events in comparison to what we just heard from the chief. Now, you testified that the DC National Guard was outfitted with standard riot gear. Now, I assume you wore that too, did you not?
Negative, sir. We actually had a shortage of riot gear. So when I was on the scene, I had a protective mask, I had a ballistic vest, but I did not have a baton, a riot shield, shin guards, or a face visor.
So in your testimony, you claimed to be the senior National Guard officer on the scene. Did you make the decision to fully outfit the DC National Guard in riot gear that day?
Negative, sir. That came from the District of Columbia National Guard commander and commanding general.
So somebody more senior than you must have anticipated some level of violence. And you told us 6 of your fellows were injured. Did you express any disagreement with your senior officer about the anticipation of violence prior to your deployment to the area?
Negative, sir. That the uniform and kit that they were outfitted with is part of the standard operating procedures for response to civil disturbance.
Okay, so now you're a military officer. We had a member from the other side of the aisle earlier ask Chief Law Enforcement Officer for our Park Police about the following illegal orders. If you thought the protesters were so peaceful, and again, you were the senior National Guard officer on the scene, why did you have your soldiers participate in this mission?
Sir, we were there in a static defensive line. We did not engage in the act of clearing of H Street.
By the way, whose order was it for curfew at 7?
That was the District of Columbia Mayor Muriel Bowser, who instituted that curfew, sir.
So can you tell me just a little bit more about the 6 members that were injured? You said one was hit by a projectile, a concussion?
That was the report I received, yes, sir.
And would you consider that peaceful
Negative, sir.
Now, while you described the protesters as peaceful, Chief Monahan testified that many protesters were violent. Please answer the following questions since we have very few time, yes or no. Chief Monahan's written testimony describes bricks and rocks being thrown at law officers. Would you consider that peaceful or violent?
Violent, sir.
Chief Monahan continued stating, caustic liquids and water bottles were also projectiles aimed at law enforcement officers. Would you consider these actions peaceful or violent?
Violent.
Chief Monahan also shared that they lit flares and fireworks or even thrown at law enforcement officers. Now, would you consider that peaceful or violent?
Violent, sir.
Finally, 2x4 sections of wood were thrown at law enforcement officers. Does this seem peaceful or violent to you?
Violent, sir.
So let me ask you another question. The conversation was talking about helicopters. And you said that you weren't privy to exactly what was happening. Could it have been used to take photographs?
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't that be a smart, intelligent application to find out how things are moving from the skies? Because you're kind of blinded on the ground, aren't you not?
Use of an aviation asset for aerial observations would give you a different lens to look at the mission as it unfolds.
It'd make it more effective, wouldn't it not?
It would add a different lens to view the mission, sir.
But it would make it more effective.
There is nothing more effective than the on-the-ground truth from the incident commander or commanders.
No. You want to make sure that you're seeing all the things happening as they're working. And you can't see that from your perspective on the ground. You don't have 365 viewpoints. You don't know what's being anticipated, what front is moving, what front is retreating. You don't know any of that. That's why air power or air traffic is very good. I mean, we use it on everyday life in cities for traffic control, do we not?
Sir, I would respectfully disagree. From my time overseas in combat zones, there is nothing more important than the sensors on the ground, which are our young men and women in uniform.
No, I totally disagree with you because, I mean, if we use it for city traffic, why wouldn't we look at pedestrian traffic as well? Because and the comments to Mr. Gomer, about the church, you weren't there, so you didn't know what was going on with the church. So from my standpoint, coordinated effect. Nothing erroneous about that application. And once again, I find it disenfranchising to say this is a peaceful demonstration. Peaceful demonstrations have an obligation when they see violence to turn them in. Otherwise, you're as guilty by association. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I'd like to place into the record information relative to Major DeMarco having to do with West Point, family issues, anticipating questions about his own character and background, and not only questions, but attacks in those regard. I want to file these and as there's no objection, so ordered. And one of the pictures has him taking a picture with him and George Bush when he was a senior at West Point. George W. Bush, a known subversive to some people, but nevertheless, I thought that was important. Let me recognize Mr. Gallegos. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Major DeMarco, how long were you at Lafayette Square? When did you get there?
Yes, sir. I arrived at approximately 5:30 p.m. that evening.
At which evening? May 29th?
June 1st.
June 1st.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What time again?
About 5:30 p.m. that evening.
Had you been on site before this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And would you describe the civilians, the protesters, how would you describe them on June 1st when you arrived?
On June 1st, it was drastically different than the night before. June 1st, I would describe them as peacefully assembled.
Right. And we can agree that May 29th, there were violent protesters.
Sir, I was only there on May 31st.
Oh, so you don't, okay.
Yeah.
What did you observe on May 31st?
May 31st, I observed a riot.
Okay.
Based off of Army Training Publication 3-39.33, it was classified as a riot.
I would say it was a riot also. But June 1st, from your estimation, that was not the case. There was peaceful protesting happening.
Based off of that same Army Training Publication, correct.
Great. You have extensive training in riot control and de-escalation training?
No formalized training, except for what I'm able to ascertain from our Army training publications and field manuals.
Mm-hmm.
I've never attended the military police course or any other additional courses.
Someone within your unit had, though, I'm assuming?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Give me 1 second here. So at 5:30, you arrive on the scene. Did you get an assessment report from somebody? So obviously you were taking over duty for that time period.
Negative, sir. We were actually just arriving. The DC National Guard was just arriving.
Just arriving, okay.
Yes, sir.
Who did you meet with there to give you an assessment of what was happening on the ground?
So when I first got there, I linked up with my park police liaison, who I'd met the previous night.
Yep.
And then was introduced to another park police officer who then gave me the task and purpose.
The park police officers, how did they describe the day to you? In their connecting with you, did they describe how the day was? What was the scenario? What was the climate?
In the situation brief that I received, it was much different than the day before.
Okay, so what was that specifically?
I can't remember, sir.
Okay. Can you describe it when you say as much different as the day before? Did they at any point seem to indicate that the crowd was calmer and more peaceful?
That was the general atmospherics, yes, sir.
And then you were told that, at what point were you told that you were going to stand in line and form essentially a wall while the park police pushed on the protesters?
That was about 5:40, 5:45 p.m.
So probably like 10 minutes after you arrived?
Yes, sir.
And the reasoning for that was?
The stated objective was to essentially clear the area to facilitate this wall or fence to come into the AO.
But there was never anything that indicated that this had to happen at X amount of time, or that there was a sense of urgency that they'd have to rush these protesters for that?
So there was, sir. When I asked, when I received the mission briefing, I specifically asked for a timeline of events. And I said, when is this going to commence? What I heard back was as soon as possible. And then I also heard that they were expecting us to be there much earlier in the evening.
Okay, got it. So when the protesters actually started getting pushed back, your standing orders were to what?
So the DC National Guard standing orders were to maintain a static perimeter along H Street. And then once the sector was cleared, they would then reinforce and relieve the Park Police on the northern border.
So essentially what you're saying for my civilian colleagues, that you're basically owning territory as you moved.
Yes.
So as the protests were pushed out, you guys were put in lines, not a phalanx, but a wall essentially, and occupying territory, so that way no protesters can sneak through.
Yes, sir.
Have you, or has anyone that you were in your unit, when you saw how they were clearing the protesters, from your experience, from anyone's experience, did you find it odd that that was the manner in which they cleared protesters? Because from my experience and the training I had, I never would have imagined that the way to clear, especially peaceful protesters, is to swinging your batons and throwing tear gas and other chemicals into a crowd, because that only induces chaos, which creates more resistance. Did you feel that, or did anyone in your unit think that this was a very odd way to clear people?
Based off of the application of the Army training publications, I saw that as an ineffective way to de-escalate the situation.
Right. Did you see any attempts of de-escalation prior to them moving on the crowd? Not taking into consideration, obviously, the radio comms situation, which we heard was problematic.
The only other attempt that would fit the parameters of the Army training publications would be the proclamation that was given.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Cox, sir, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Major DeMarco, in his testimony and answers to our questions, Acting Chief Monahan characterized the crowd at Lafayette Square on June 1st prior to 6:35 as violent. In fact, he said in his written testimony, quote, "An on-the-ground assessment of the violence and danger presented by the crowd led to the clearing of the park and the installation of the fence," end quote. I'd like to play some video from Lafayette Square in the evening of June 1st and ask you a few questions about it. Unlike the videos my Republican colleagues played at the last meeting, this video is actually from Lafayette Square on June 1st, not from some other cities or other days or other countries. Let's play the video. These videos show the protest crowd before the Park Police. Oh, go ahead.
We have no mask. What are y'all protecting yourselves from? The tear gas is spraying on us? We don't have any weapons. No weapons. We just have our words. We just want some equality. That's all we want. What else can we do?
Thanks so much. Those videos show the protest crowd before the Park Police and the other officers attacked. Major DeMarco, did that video show a riot or other violent activity?
No, sir.
I would certainly agree with that. Did anything you see in either of those videos justify the way law enforcement cleared the protesters from the area?
Not from those videos, no, sir.
I'd agree with you on that again. And from what you saw, do these videos represent the overall demeanor of the crowd attending the protest that day?
I can't generally characterize the crowd, but from what I observed, that is correct.
No, thanks so much. The fact that Mr. Monahan can't even acknowledge that the protest that day was peaceful tells us something very troubling about the administration's conduct that day. And it should make us all wonder whether our government even understands the difference between an unruly violent mob and people peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. And even worse is the fact is that we're seeing this administration continue and expand this authoritarian approach with these crackdowns in Portland and other major cities. To me, this is an attack on our democracy. This is an attack on our Constitution. Now, I used to remember when the other side used to call themselves constitutionalists. We pledge fealty to the Constitution. We're a constitutional conservative. Where has that gone? You know, in your testimony here today, I can imagine that this is putting you in grave, great, maybe professional, personal jeopardy. Would that statement be true?
Recent events certainly have me concerned, sir.
You know, and just getting back to the oath that we both swore to protect and to defend the Constitution of the United States, is that not the bedrock guiding principle that defends our way of life?
I would agree with you 100%, sir.
And is that why you're here today?
Absolutely, sir.
Well, I think it's a great tribute to our late, great colleague, Representative John Lewis, that when you see something that is not right, not just, not fair, you have a moral obligation to say something, to do something. With your presence here today, you were saying something and doing something. And on behalf of certainly grateful Congressman here, I want to thank you for your service, and to your family, express my sentiments. I think you're a hero. With that, I'll yield the balance of my time.
Let me recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield my time to Mr. Gomer.
I appreciate my colleagues so much, personally and professionally. Thank you. Major, there is a significant difference between members of Congress taking the oath of office and those of us that have taken a commissioned officer oath of office, because obviously we're in the military, we have superior officers, whereas in Congress, my superiors are the 800,000 or so that I serve. And I can't be court-martialed for disrespecting the people that I serve. Not that I would do that. But I'm curious, you know, you mentioned in your opening statement about, you said I was tasked to serve as a liaison between the DC National Guard's Task Force Civil Disturbance and the Park Police at Lafayette Square. Who else was a liaison? You say you were one of them. You were a liaison. Who else was a liaison in that capacity?
Yes, sir. So we had several officers that were liaisons to different agencies across the National Capital Region. I was just the Park Police liaison for that specific operation.
And who tasked you, who ordered you to take that position?
That was the commander of the Task Force Civil Disturbance.
Who?
It was a commander, sir. I would rather not reference his name.
Oh, so we can't verify that you were tasked with that position. We're just forced to take your word for it. So when you say commander, commander of what?
The commander of the task force, sir.
So that's the DC National Guard's Task Force Civil Disobedience.
Disturbance.
Disturbance. Right. Okay. Now, in your testimony, you stated the materials to erect the security barrier did not arrive, and I'm quoting, did not arrive on the scene until around 9 p.m. Chief Monahan testified to a much different timeline with materials arriving earlier in the afternoon. So are you feeling strongly enough about them arriving at 9 p.m. that you would believe Chief Monahan was lying?
Sir, I can only speak to my account, and as a fact witness, the times that I have presented are accurate.
So it's not possible, according to you, that the materials to build a security barrier did not arrive earlier that afternoon?
Sir, I can't talk about hypotheticals.
It's not a hypothetical. I'm asking you specifically. Is it possible, based on your knowledge and what you saw and observed, that those materials could have arrived much earlier?
It's certainly a possibility. However, based off of my statement and timeline of events as a fact witness, the materials did not arrive on H Street until 9 p.m. that
Well,
evening.
you keep saying you're a fact witness, but you're also apparently being put up as a legal expert because you've indicated a number of times these people were there to observe their First Amendment rights. So, and I understand with your MBA, that apparently qualifies you to make constitutional judgments like that. But isn't it possible that those materials did arrive earlier and were at another location at the staging area?
It's certainly possible, sir.
All right. I have nothing further. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Garcia, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major DeMarco, thank you for being here today and for providing your honest testimony. Your testimony has been extremely enlightening, and I think that it makes it even more clear that what this administration did that day was not only inappropriate, but also reckless and most likely unconstitutional. One of the things that you said in your testimony was that Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miley, approached you before the incident. After you briefed him, General Miley told you to ensure that the National Guardsmen remain calm and that you all must respect the demonstrators' First Amendment's right. Before the law enforcement surge, did you see protest activity that crossed the line from First Amendment protected activity to violence, rioting, and other behavior that we don't generally consider protected under the Constitution?
Sir, based off of Army Training Publication 3-39.33, specifically Chapter 2-14, crowd management tactics, the situation there would be construed as lawfully assembled.
Thank you. Aside from the General's comments to you about the First Amendment, did the General give you any indication or show any concern that the protesters' rights may be violated?
Negative, sir.
Okay. What was your reaction to seeing what the federal government did to those protesters as they exercised their First Amendment rights?
I was certainly surprised at the timeline of events and certainly the escalation of events.
Very well. Black and brown communities are already being ravaged by the deadly virus and an unprecedented economic crisis. Now they're being terrorized by a threat of a militarized, secret, and federal police force. In Washington, D.C., we've discussed it at length today, in Portland, possibly in Chicago. Trump's violent oppression of demonstrators in Lafayette Square was not only reckless, it is a direct threat to our democracy, and it is staring at us in the eye. The actions leading up to Trump's photo op have drawn outrage from around the world. The kind of actions we would normally condemn in other countries are now happening here at home. Demonstrations like the ones we've witnessed in the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others should never be met with deadly force by law enforcement. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Levin, sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major DeMarco, you mentioned in your statement that you've served in combat zones and understand how to assess threat environments. With regard to Lafayette Square, you said that at no time did you feel threatened by the protesters or assess them to be violent. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You also mentioned in your statement that it was your observation that the use of force against protesters in the clearing operation was an unnecessary escalation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you also have had extensive training in dealing with protests and protesters known technically as, quote, civil disturbances, as have all the D.C. National Guard that were there on June 1st. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Could you please explain the fundamental strategy of graduated responses specific to civil disturbance and why that is important?
Yes, sir. A graduated response process, as annotated in Army Training Publication 3-39.33, entitled Civil Disturbances, is a measured approach to a response or in response to a crowd gathering. By recognizing a use of force policy, soldiers must be taught and to understand that they use the minimum force necessary.
Thank you. Please continue.
It continues, sir. Without the appearance of a graduated response, the gathering crowd may consider actions as excessive, causing a possible escalation of hostilities or violence.
So what we're hearing is that the widespread violation of rights at Lafayette Square was acceptable because there was violence happening before June 1st and in other places. In your training, should the events of prior days be used as a pretext to immediately escalate force?
Absolutely not, sir.
Now, let's say hypothetically that there was truly widespread violence. In fact, let's say this was an actual war zone where violence was persistent and ubiquitous, but on one particular day, the protests were peaceful. Major DeMarco, you've done tours of duty in different places across the globe, including Iraq. If the events on June 1st in Lafayette Square were happening in Iraq when you were serving, would you have been able to handle protests the way the Park Police and their partners handled them on June 1st?
Negative, sir. Based off of the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993 ratified by the Senate in 1997 and FM 6-7, that's incorrect. We would not be able to handle or use riot control agents in dispersing the crowds.
And Major, could you describe in the broadest terms what the Geneva Convention is, who it is meant for, and what happens to someone that violates it?
Sir, I'm not a legal expert. I can't talk about what happens in violation of the Geneva Conventions, but I can say that it specifically prohibits riot control agents from being used in a war zone.
Major DeMarco, earlier this morning, we heard from Acting Chief Monahan, who said the officers used, and I quote, tremendous restraint. Based on your training and your experience, what do you think of that statement from Acting Chief Monahan?
Sir, my opinion, tremendous restraint does not involve the use of defensive equipment as weapons.
So it wouldn't be tremendous restraint?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Yields back. Let me, Mr. Soto, you recognize, sir. Mr. Gett, recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Byer.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am here and thrilled to be included. Major DeMarco.
You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major DeMarco, the administration has given the operation to install fencing as one excuse why the protesters were violently cleared from Lafayette Square on June 1. But we know that the clearing commenced around 6:30. You've also said in your testimony that the crowd did not appear to hear the warnings and it was cleared well before the curfew at 7 p.m. You also said in your written statement that the crowd was peaceful. You testified that the fencing arrived around 9 p.m. How did you know that?
Sir, I had made visual observations of the fencing as it arrived on H Street.
And you were pushed back on that by some of my Republican friends earlier. You were at 16th and H Street, right? And the fence was supposed to go up along H?
That's correct, sir.
And the fence was going to go from Connecticut Avenue along H all the way to Vermont along H? And that's,
yes, sir.
And that's about 2 blocks. And isn't 16th Street right in the middle of those 2 blocks?
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't it have been almost impossible not to see big trucks pulling up with fences at either end of those blocks?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, I think your testimony on the 9 p.m. is very, very credible. Major, based on your training in civil disturbances, when's the best time to set up a new perimeter or install a fence?
Sir, to set up a new perimeter or a new defensive or security posture would certainly be in the early morning hours before the general public would be awake.
Why would it be unwise to set up a new perimeter or new fence in the middle of the day when the number of protesters is at its peak? Does it present any danger to law enforcement personnel or to the protesters?
Yes, sir. I can't speak for law enforcement personnel. I can tell you as a commander, or if I were the officer in charge, I certainly would not look for the high time of like foot traffic to set those up.
Were you ever told, Major, why the fence operation was going to go forward during the peak time of the late afternoon or evening while the protest was at its peak, rather than at night or rather than the next morning?
No, sir.
So, I mean, it would certainly make sense that it should have been set up sometime later when the crowd was smaller or after the curfew.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Major, you mentioned in your written testimony that Attorney General Barr was on the scene talking with the Park Police shortly before the clearing happened. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Do you think he had something to do with the order to clear protesters? Or do you believe that this was simply a remarkable coincidence?
Sir, I can't offer my opinion. I can just give you the facts as I saw them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we've heard a few things. Installing fencing in the middle of a protest is not a sound practice. The fencing didn't even arrive until hours after the protesters were cleared. The crowd was peaceful, not adequately warned, dispersed suddenly, shortly after Attorney General Barr left Lafayette Square. And President Trump just happened to have a photo op shortly after the clearing. Major DeMarco, the crowd wasn't violent. The fencing didn't arrive till much later. What's the most logical reason you can think of for why the violent clearing of protesters happened, given your knowledge and expertise?
Sir, I can't hypothesize or speculate onto the events and why they transpired along the timeline that they did.
Okay, I appreciate your sticking to the facts-based stuff. Major, my number one constituent complaint is helicopter noise, because I represent the district that includes the Pentagon and much else. I'm trying to think in the 70 years I've lived in and around Washington, inaugurations, the Women's March, lots and lots and lots of marches and demonstrations, any other time, unmarked, low-flying helicopters were used. Can you remember any other time with the many different demonstrations that we've had?
No, sir.
Yeah, nor can I, which I think was why it was so upsetting for so many people to have these things that once again suggested that we're in Afghanistan rather than in downtown Washington, D.C. Major, thank you very much for coming forward. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Major DeMarco, let me thank you. I appreciate information, your testimony, and the fortitude to come forward. Given the reputation and the actions of this administration, retaliation and retribution is not beyond them, and we have many cases to point in that direction. So I appreciate it, and all of us do. Let me ask you just some quick questions, and there was one. Oh yeah, Major, does running for Congress disqualify you for being a truthful person?
No, sir.
And I'm glad you answered it that way. Otherwise, many of us would be in considerable amount of trouble right now. Attorney General Barr has said that a June 1st incident was a result of ordinary planning to extend the perimeter line. We've already talked about that, around Lafayette Square, having absolutely nothing to do with giving the president his photo opportunity at the church. Based on what you witnessed, what you know about that day, your testimony, is it satisfactory? Is that explanation satisfactory?
Sir, respectfully, I'm not here to hypothesize. I'm just a fact-based witness. I can't talk about the causation or correlation of
And
those events.
one other thing I was going to ask you is, Major, is you testified that no National Guardsmen had lethal or non-lethal munitions that evening at Lafayette Square. Are you aware of any munitions being readied for use by the National Guard?
On the evening of June 1st, the only munitions that I'm aware of is the transfer of weapons from Fort Belvoir up to the DC Armory, and that was my unit.
Okay, and what kind of these?
So they were M4 carbines, sir.
And that's an assault rifle?
It's of the assault rifle variation.
And do you know what the reposition was in preparation for?
I don't know what it was in preparation for. I just know that my soldiers executed that movement.
Okay, thank you. There's, the issue that we're confronting across this country right now is a question of the protest across this country, and I think Lafayette was a precursor and pretext to a lot of the discussion that's going on. And this hearing is not just simply about what happened in Lafayette Square, but also the pretext and the precedent there. You might not want to speculate or state the opinion on that, Mr. DeMarco, but I firmly believe that what happened in Lafayette Square was a consequence to creating a photo opportunity and a theme and a campaign theme for President Trump, and that Attorney General Barr was making the calls all the way along the line. And we'll continue to seek information and pursue that. But I also think that what's going on in the nation right now, that there is peaceful, lawful First Amendment demonstrations going on. And the vast majority of people involved in them are people that respect that, nonviolent and peaceful, just like John Lewis and that legacy. The opportunists who attempt to hijack that either for a political agenda that does not fit into the Black Lives Matter movement or to the social justice movement, they're political opportunists. And the criminal opportunists that see it as a chance to do other kinds of harms to property and people, they're going to take advantage of it. But to use a broad brush, as this administration used at Lafayette Square, that everybody that was in that place and that square were criminals, anarchists, and bent on destruction of federal assets and attacking federal police, in this instance, the Park Service. I believe that is absolutely false. And those false generalizations that are coming in, by this administration and this law and order kick that they're on are just that, generalizations, and in some cases, outright lies. And I think we should be very concerned about the creeping authoritarianism that is going on, that is making the question that we're asking here today more and more relevant and more urgent. With that, meeting's adjourned and yield back. And thank you very much, Mr. Mark.
Thank you, sir.